From the outside looking in, Ramon Souza was living the dream. The former pro boxer was doing very well for himself back in 2009. He owned a gym in Houston, Texas, was raking in the dough, was attending parties with the rich and famous, and, best of all, was about to marry the woman of his dreams, Lulu Dorantes, a Mexican living in the USA on a visitor's visa. Family life suited Ramon well. As all of his friends would tell you, the guy was made to be a husband, and, as Ramon himself put it, his loyal fiancée Lulu treated him like a king. As one family friend said, she was great. She'd bring him coffee and get up every morning with him and make him breakfast. I just thought it was really neat, their relationship. You know, they got along really well. Everyone thought Lulu was the model partner. Kind, generous, and loving. But there was one person who wasn't so keen on her. Ramon's daughter, Mia. Mia knew that the face that Lulu showed the world was really a mask, and that beneath that warm exterior was a cold-hearted woman who only cared about two things: money and herself. Lulu hated Ramon spending money on Mia, or any of his other children for that matter. In Lulu's mind, Ramon's free time and money was reserved for her and her children. Mia would complain about this to her father, but her words usually fell on deaf ears. Ramon had been taken in by Lulu's charms long ago, and for the most part, he sided with his wife. All he had ever seen was the good in her, the mask that she wore. By March of 2009, Mia and her father had drifted further and further apart, to the point that when Ramon and Lulu got married, she didn't even attend their wedding. But it seems that Mia wasn't the only one who knew about Lulu's dark side. Just after the couple exchanged their vows and were legally wed, Lulu's mother came up to Ramon and whispered something in his ear. "Now, she's your trouble." Nonsense, thought Ramon. My wife's no trouble at all. I can trust her. By 2010, Ramon's business was doing so well that he opened up a second gym in Houston, this time with his wife Lulu by his side. She worked alongside him as a personal trainer and also took care of the books. It wasn't long before the couple were making $20,000 a month in profit. But despite the sweetness of all that cash, this was when their relationship started to sour. Lulu began telling her friends that Ramon was lazy and that she was doing the lion's share of the work. Whether that was true or not, Lulu evidently decided she was entitled to a bigger cut of the profits. The gym was getting busier. Ramon was taking on more and more clients, but for some reason, the gym's earnings weren't increasing. He began to suspect that his once trusted wife was stealing money from the business. His suspicions weren't misplaced. Lulu was skimming extra money and was using it to pay for a divorce attorney. She filed for divorce and made baseless claims that Ramon was violent and physically aggressive towards her. Even so, the couple continued to live together during their separation, albeit on different floors of the house. This is where things took a supremely dark and unexpected turn. The divorcing couple had a mutual friend named Mundo. While Mundo was at their gym, he happened to overhear a conversation that Lulu was having with her daughter of all people. Inside the gym's office, Lulu was saying that one of her customers knew a hitman, a guy from Mexico who chops people up for money, and saying how they could potentially use him to make Ramon disappear. That way, the two gyms would be hers and hers alone, as well as the house, all of Ramon's assets, and the cash from his life insurance policy. After hearing that, Mundo approached Lulu in private and said that he himself knew someone who could do the job for her instead. Someone reliable, professional, trustworthy. Lulu trusted Mundo and told him to set things up with the assassin. But much like Ramon shouldn't have trusted Lulu, Lulu shouldn't have trusted Mundo. Not about to let his friend be murdered, Mundo left the gym and called Ramon. "Hey man, Lulu wants to kill you," he said, before explaining the entire situation. Ramon was in disbelief. He knew his wife had fallen out of love with him, sure, but he didn't think she'd take things that far. In his mind, hiring a contract killer to take out your spouse was something that only happened in Hollywood movies, not in real life. Not to him. Ramon went straight to the police and asked them to help him, but there was very little they could do without any evidence. So, Mundo and Ramon decided to hatch their own sting operation. Using disposable phones, the two of them would message one another about the fake hit, Mundo playing himself, Ramon playing his own killer. Mundo then showed these messages to Lulu, who, in turn, became more confident that this contract killer was legit. It also made it less likely that she'd go ahead and hire a real killer in the meantime, though that of course didn't stop Ramon from looking over his shoulder during those days. He lived in constant terror that someone was already out to get him, and even slept with a pistol under his pillow, just in case. And remember, during this time, Lulu was still living in the same house as him. All he could do was play dumb and hope for the best. The real turning point in their sting was when Mundo secretly recorded this conversation with Lulu. Now, with Lulu on the hook, and with recorded evidence that she genuinely wanted to kill her husband, the authorities were finally able to get involved. They set up a meeting between Lulu and a hitman played by an undercover detective. On the night of July 20th, 2015, Lulu drove to an empty parking lot, bringing with her $500 as a down payment for the hit, as well as Ramon's own watches and jewelry. In a sense, she was making Ramon pay for his own execution. Lulu met the undercover agent, paid him, and drove off into the night. With cash exchanged, the cops could now prove intent. But to really give them an airtight case, there was one last thing they had to do. They had to watch makeup tutorials on YouTube. I'm not even joking. From those makeup videos, the detectives learned how to apply some realistic-looking makeup onto Ramon's face and make it look like he was a dead body. They had him lay in a shallow grave with a fake hole in his head and took a photo of him, pretending to be dead, then had him lay low for 3 days so Lulu would think he really was taken care of. "Nobody knew where I was, even my family," said Ramon. "Everybody was looking for me. I was very, very upset. Rage and sadness. All the emotions came through me." On July 23rd, a final meeting was set up between Lulu and the undercover agent posing as Ramon's assassin. This time, they were going to film the entire thing. Lulu arrived just as planned and stepped into the undercover agent's car. "It's done," said the agent. "We got him today, this morning." Lulu paid him $1,000 more, and after receiving it, the agent took out his phone and showed her the photo of Ramon, dead in a ditch. "The dumbass fought," said the agent. "He fought?" replied Lulu. She then laughed at the thought of it. There was no sense of remorse or regret or even shock as she stared blankly at the picture of her husband. She was ice cold. The agent recounted Ramon's final moments and how he had pleaded for his life. "Well, he won't wake up anymore," Lulu said, before laughing psychotically again. She promised to get the killer the $3,000 she still owed him, then exited the vehicle and drove off once more. The following morning, officers went to the gym and asked Lulu if they could talk to her in private. For a few minutes, they acted as if they were doing a wellness check on Ramon and asked Lulu if she knew where he was. Lulu acted coolly, feigning ignorance, as if she hadn't just tried to have Ramon killed. Finally, the cops ended their charade and told Lulu she was under arrest. As they led her to the cruiser outside, it finally dawned on her. She'd been duped. With so much evidence against her, Lulu took a 20-year plea deal. She also had to give her share of the gym and house to her still very much alive husband, Ramon. The detectives determined that Ramon hadn't physically hurt Lulu like she had claimed, and didn't pursue any charges related to those baseless assertions. The former pro boxer had just survived the biggest fight of his life, and with his now ex-wife's plot foiled and her true nature exposed, he was able to start repairing the damage to his own reputation, as well as his relationship with his daughter, Mia. The one thing he'll likely never be able to fix, however, is his ability to trust any romantic partners ever again. Now, how could you resist a smile like that? This interesting-looking gentleman is Satoshi Uematsu, a young man who recently became infamous throughout Japan for all the wrong reasons. Fresh out of college, Satoshi began working as a teacher at an elementary school, but quickly decided that kids were much too stressful to deal with. They had too much energy, were too hard to control. As such, at the young age of 23, he left the school to take on his new role as a carer at Tsukui Yamayuri-en, a residential care center for people with intellectual and physical disabilities. Set in almost 8 acres of beautiful woodland in Sagamihara, Kanagawa, the center was home to 149 residents, their ages ranging from 19 to 75. All of their conditions varied wildly, some of them able to exercise and enjoy the stunning surroundings, others completely unable to get out of bed. It was the latter that Satoshi took an interest in. In February 2016, after working at the facility for 3 years, Satoshi suddenly resigned without any explanation. His colleagues were surprised. The now 26-year-old was considered a diligent, hard-working, considerate and friendly young man, and his resignation seemingly came out of nowhere and was perceived as strangely out of character and rude. Others were sad to see him go, but weren't surprised. Satoshi's attitude and entire personality had started changing in the past few months. Sure, that could have been down to job dissatisfaction, but they sensed it was something more. Something deeper. The same month he left the care home, Satoshi traveled to Tokyo and attempted to deliver a handwritten letter to Japan's Speaker of the House of Representatives, Tadamori Oshima. He went directly to Oshima's house to do so, but was intercepted by security guards and turned away. The next day, he tried and failed again, and so left his letter with Oshima's security. Oshima eventually got around to reading it. It was a horrifying read. The letter talked about how it should be legal for disabled people to be killed at the request of their guardians, and how Satoshi needed Oshima's help to deliver the message to Japan's then Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. In the first half of the letter, Satoshi wrote, "I envision a world where a person with multiple disabilities can be euthanized, with an agreement from their guardians of course, when it's difficult for that person to carry out household and social activities. These slayings," he said, "would be for the sake of Japan and world peace." Bizarrely, or more bizarrely I should say, the letter detailed how these deaths would benefit the global economy and, quote-unquote, prevent World War III. The second half of the letter was much more disturbing than the first, however. In that second half, he detailed his plan to break into 2 facilities and said that he planned to kill 460 people. He said that he'd tie up the staff and wouldn't hurt them, and would slay all the patients quickly and painlessly as not to make them suffer too much. There was nothing to worry about, however. He promised to turn himself in after all the carnage was over. At the bottom of the letter, Satoshi left his name, contact information, and home address. Needless to say, Oshima didn't deliver the message to Prime Minister Abe, and instead gave it to the police. Satoshi was apprehended and committed to a mental hospital for 12 days, after which he was deemed not to be a threat and released. The decision to release him would have dire consequences. On July 26, 2016, at 2:10 a.m., Satoshi took a trip to his old workplace, the Tsukui Yamayuri-en Care Center. Using a hammer, he broke in through a glass window on the bottom floor. He tied up one of the only staff members on duty and took their keys. He then made his way down the hallway, going from room to room, stabbing each sleeping patient in the neck with a sharp blade that he had brought with him. At 2:30 a.m., a full 20 minutes after he had broken in, other staff members finally called the authorities and reported what was happening. Due to the facility's remote location, it was going to take them some time to get there. At 2:50 a.m., Satoshi was caught on camera leaving the building. 10 minutes after that, the police finally arrived and found no trace of him anywhere in the surrounding area. 29 ambulances also arrived at the scene and saved as many residents as they could. In total, 19 patients died from their neck wounds, 10 female, 9 male. The youngest deceased victim was only 19 years old. A further 26 were injured, 13 of them critically. While Satoshi stayed true to his promise, and 2 hours after his massacre, he turned himself into the authorities, bringing with him a bag full of sharp and bloody blades. The incident was immediately recognized as one of the worst attacks committed on Japanese soil in modern history. All of Satoshi's former co-workers were in disbelief when they heard the news. Some of them knew that he had become slightly unhinged, but they never suspected he'd do something like this. Satoshi's defense lawyers argued that the young man wasn't mentally fit to stand trial. According to them, the young killer often partook in, let's call it the devil's lettuce. Now, culturally speaking, the Japanese don't view the green herb the same way we do in the West, and the defense team tried to suggest that puffing the magic dragon had made Satoshi crazed and murderous. As such, he was examined, and it was determined that he was competent and able to stand trial. That didn't stop Satoshi from trying to act as crazy as possible during his time in court, however, and at one point, he even tried to bite his own finger off in front of the judges. His antics were all in vain. On March 16th, 2020, nearly 4 years after taking 19 lives, Satoshi was sentenced to death by hanging. Though he said he wouldn't appeal and that he accepted the sentence, the remorseless Satoshi was convinced he didn't deserve it, claiming that people unable to communicate and care for themselves, quote-unquote, create unhappiness in society, and that they have no heart. Since there's still a big stigma surrounding people with disabilities in Japan, Satoshi was genuinely surprised that his actions didn't receive more support. As of making this video, the date of Satoshi Uematsu's execution is yet to be set. "30-year-old Stanislav Reshetnikov was a YouTuber from Russia who gained a small fanbase with his video game-related content, which he uploaded to his channel, Stas Reeflay. When he wasn't making gaming videos, you could usually find Stas live streaming on the site, or more accurately, trash streaming. Trash streams are pretty much bottom-of-the-barrel entertainment, where viewers pay the streamer money to do embarrassing things on camera. As you can imagine, depending on the sordidness of the audience and the brazenness of the streamer, these types of live shows can go south pretty quickly. With the internet being what it is, that happens quite often, and happened regularly on the Stas Reeflay channel. Stas had a reputation for being cruel to his quote-unquote co-stars during the live streams, doing things like pepper spraying his girlfriend multiple times, forcing another man to drink oil, all for the sake of donations. Even still, nobody expected things to go as far as they did during the Russians' final livestream. On December 2nd of last year, Stas and his girlfriend Valentina were streaming live alongside their mutual friend Marina. To begin with, they streamed themselves eating, drinking and just hanging out. Things eventually took a turn for the worse, however, when a viewer suddenly paid Stas $1,000. This payment came with a request. "I want you to beat Valentina and lock her outside in the freezing cold." This is when the stream became uncomfortable viewing. Seeing how much the guy had paid, Stas wanted to honor the request. The couple began screaming and arguing with each other, and things escalated to the point where Valentina grabbed a blade from the kitchen and held it out in front of her for protection. Undeterred, Stas tore off all of Valentina's clothes, poured cold water all over her, and began dragging her towards the balcony. She desperately tried to grab a jacket, but Stas refused to let her. He tossed her outside without anything to keep her warm, and locked the balcony doors. This being Moscow in the wintertime, the temperature outside was sub-zero, around -8 degrees Celsius. The stream continued with just Stas and Marina, though all the while, Valentina could be heard banging on the door outside, begging to be let back in. Though Marina appeared concerned, Stas was apathetic to her pleas, and he left Valentina outside on the veranda for over 2 hours. He wanted his anonymous benefactor to get his money's worth. Time went by, and Marina left, leaving Stas alone in the apartment. When he finally went to let Valentina back inside, he found her unconscious, her skin a whitish blue, With the camera still rolling, he dragged her back inside for all his viewers to see. Finally realizing what had happened, he began trying to wake Valentina up and could be heard saying things on stream like, "Valia, are you alive? My bunny, what's wrong with you? Bunny, come on. Tell me something. I'm worrying. Damn, I can't feel a heartbeat." He continued to try and revive her, feebly giving her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but by that point, it was far too late. Valentina had perished in the cold. She was just 28 years old. She was in the early stages of pregnancy. It was later confirmed that a blow to the head from Stas may have contributed to her demise. In the final stages of the livestream, Stas picked up his lifeless girlfriend and placed her on the sofa behind him, before sitting back down in his gamer chair to address his viewers directly. "Guys, no pulse. She's pale. She's not breathing." He then finally decided to call an ambulance. He continued to stream while he waited for help to arrive, playing music and zooming the camera in on Valentina's face. He was still streaming when the medics arrived to pronounce Valentina. They asked Stas to stop streaming while they worked, but he didn't. He streamed the whole thing. By this point, he had over 1,500 viewers still tuned in, and continued to receive donations from people telling him not to end the stream. He obliged them, and continued streaming for an additional 2 hours after the medics left with Valentina. The authorities later came to pick him up. As this all happened so recently, the case against Stas is still ongoing, and he's currently being held by the authorities. Unfortunately, due to Russia's lax laws, if it's deemed in court that his actions led to Valentina's passing, he only faces up to 2 years in prison. He still maintains that he didn't do anything wrong. Unfortunately, though the Stas Reeflay channel's now gone, there are still many other channels like his that continue to make this type of horrific content, especially in Russia. As long as there's a market for live torment, these types of trash streamers will continue to exist. It's unsettling to think how many ordinary people there are who get a kick out of watching this type of stream. Though nobody will ever admit it, I guarantee that it's far more people than you'd like to believe. On the 1st of May 2014, 88-year-old World War II veteran Russell Dermond was going about his business in the small Georgia town of Eatonton. It was 2 days before Kentucky Derby Day, a widely celebrated calendar date among a certain section of older folks below the Mason-Dixon line, and every year, the Dermonds' neighbours threw a party to celebrate. Having grown up in central New Jersey, Russell had volunteered for the US Navy during World War II, and had served with distinction in America's Atlantic Fleet. He met his wife, Shirley, around Christmas time of 1950, and the couple went on to have 4 children together. The couple was still very much in love in 2014, so when Shirley asked him to pop into town and pick up a few bits and pieces for the party, Russell was every part the dutiful husband. Yet little did the townsfolk and store clerks know that this was the last time anyone would see Russell alive. Come the day of the party, the neighbours quickly noted that Russell and Shirley weren't there. They'd never missed a year yet. But although their failure to attend was worrying, their friends and neighbours told themselves that there must have been an innocent, rational explanation. It wasn't until almost a week after Russell was last seen that someone thought to head over to the Dermond household and see if they were okay. After getting no reply from ringing the front doorbell, the concerned neighbour happened to try the doorknob and found the door to be completely unlocked. At first, the house seemed empty, and it took quite a while to properly explore the 3,200 square foot, $1 million property. It was only when neighbours entered the house's spacious garage that they discovered anything of note, and the discovery was a horrifying one. Russell Dermond's headless corpse was lying in a pool of blood on the floor of the 2-car garage. His severed head was nowhere to be seen. Terrified by this, the neighbour rushed back home to call the police, and soon their quiet, rural community was practically overrun with uniformed officers. They closed off the house and began combing it for evidence. 87-year-old Shirley Dermond was nowhere to be found, and neither was Russell Dermond's severed head. It soon became apparent that his killer must have taken it, possibly as some kind of trophy. Nothing had been stolen. There didn't appear to be any forced entry. Nothing to give police an idea of motive. Investigators made every effort to track Shirley down, but couldn't find a single trace of her. It was initially suspected that she had been taken by her husband's killer. However, just 1 week later, her body was discovered floating in a nearby lake by a group of horrified fishermen. Her killer, or killers, had attempted to weigh her down with concrete blocks, but her bloated corpse had broken free from its bonds before drifting to the surface. Forensic examiners determined that she had been killed by strikes from a blunt object, and that she hadn't been killed in the Dermond family home. To this day, Russell Dermond's head has never been found. Taking his head might have been an act of practicality rather than perversity. You see, it's possible that Russell Dermond's killer actually murdered him by shooting him in the head, and if the bullet was of a low enough caliber, there's a chance it didn't actually exit his skull. If that's the case, an intelligent killer may have considered the ballistic evidence, in which case they were faced with a very grisly prospect indeed. Saw off the man's head and take it with them, or leave behind the evidence. Given the presence of gunshot residue found in the Dermond home, there's enough conclusive proof that a gunshot was the cause of death. But the frightening reality is that it's actually more likely the killer removed Russell's head as a trophy, as surely they'd dig around for the bullet, pull it out, then dispose of the butchered head to distance themselves from the murder. Yet despite countless searches, Russell Dermond's severed head has never been recovered. Detectives began to intensively question the Dermonds' friends and family. They also scoured the couple's financial records for anything that might put them on the killer's trail. Russell, a keen golfer, had owned several outlets of the chain restaurant Hardee's in Atlanta, Georgia, and had gotten rather wealthy in the process. It was purported that Russell may have made himself a few enemies along the way, but not a single person close to him could think of who that might be. Shirley Dermond had been a housewife. She had enjoyed gardening, playing bridge, and doing crossword puzzles. They lived a quiet life. They were adored by almost everyone who knew them, so why were they targeted in such a brutal attack? In 2016, the couple's son, Keith, said that he hadn't given up hope of catching his parents' killer, but a statement he gave to the media had a distinctly fatalistic tone to it. "It's very hard to catch somebody when you don't even know their motive. You have no clue as to what you're looking for. I always thought that, maybe it was some kind of serial killer kind of thing, just because of the weird things the guy did. But a lot of the times, serial killers are very hard to catch. They know what they're doing." Keith added that his last, best hope is the police linking his parents' murder to another, but so far, nothing has come up as a match. It's been 7 years since Russell and Shirley Dermond were murdered. 7 long years of grieving, wondering, and begging for justice. And in that time, a person has been free to roam the state of Georgia with the memory of beheading a pensioner locked away in their mind. Maura Murray was a 21-year-old nursing student at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. On February 9th, 2004, she disappeared from the face of the earth after getting into a car accident on Route 112. The events leading up to her vanishing are both cryptic and suspicious to say the least, and transform this from an ordinary missing persons case to a truly intriguing, albeit bone-chilling, mystery. Just before leaving her university campus that fateful afternoon, Maura emailed her professors, informing them that she was taking a week off school due to a loss in the family. That was a lie. Nobody in Maura's family had passed on. This got people thinking that maybe Maura was running from something. Or someone. Even before that day, Maura had been acting unusually. 3 months before she went missing, Maura had been caught using a stolen credit card to pay for meals at restaurants. 4 days prior to vanishing, a university supervisor noticed that Maura had broken down in tears. When they approached her, they said that Maura was just completely zoned out, no reaction at all, totally unresponsive. 2 days prior, Maura accidentally smashed her father's car into a guardrail after possibly consuming a few drinks. A few hours before the incident, Maura withdrew $280 from an ATM for unknown reasons. Sometime between 4 and 5 p.m. on the day of her disappearance, she set off in her car. She made no calls to tell anyone about her planned destination. It was sometime after 7 PM that Maura crashed her vehicle into a snowbank. The authorities arrived at the scene. Her car's windshield was cracked, the airbags were deployed, but there was no sign of Maura Murray anywhere. Expensive items, such as diamond jewelry, were found inside the car, along with empty bottles, Maura's AAA card, and a book called Not Without Peril, a guide to climbing in the White Mountains. Since that collision, Maura's whereabouts and well-being remain unknown. She simply disappeared from the face of the earth, never to be seen or heard from again. Some believe personal problems got the better of her, and she went missing on her own accord. Others believe that something more nefarious happened to her, that she was chased down by some obsessive stalker, or that she caught a ride with the wrong guy. For the longest time, there were no developments in the case. Then, exactly 8 years after Maura vanished, this video, titled Happy Anniversary, was uploaded to YouTube. That's the whole video. This old guy just stares into the camera, laughing, then gives a knowing wink. The words Happy Anniversary are then plastered over the screen. This Happy Anniversary video was uploaded on the 8th anniversary of Maura Murray's disappearance. It was uploaded by a user named 112 Dirtbag. Maura had vanished en route 112, and her father had famously used the word dirtbags to describe whoever had taken her. This was no coincidence. This old man wasn't just making an anniversary video for his wife and then suddenly remembered something really funny. This was intentional. It didn't take long before other users started making these connections. Word started spreading that 112 Dirtbag was responsible for whatever happened to Maura Murray, and this video was uploaded to torment her family, laughing at the fact that he'd gotten away with what he had done. This was brought to the attention of the authorities, and an investigation began. Despite taking the video off the site, the guy behind the channel, a man named Alden Olson, also from Massachusetts, was tracked down and questioned. People thought this was going to be a huge break in the case. In actuality, the whole thing was a hoax. He was just some old codger who'd become enthralled by Maura's disappearance, and wanted to insert himself into it in some way. It was all just a joke. A big, funny joke. Good one, Alden. To this day, we still don't know what happened to Maura. I'm inclined to believe that the loss in her family she was talking about was in reference to herself. She then either started a new life somewhere else, or ended the one she already had. Still, even though this dirtbag wasn't responsible for her disappearance, it's completely possible another dirtbag was. We don't have any answers, so all we can do is speculate, and hope for the best. A big shout out to Reddit user Hey Lurker here for making one of the only English write-ups of this next mysterious incident. There's something about the open ocean that's inherently unsettling to a lot of people. We all know that the sea can be a cruel mistress, and that in her dark depths she also harbours a lot of equally dark secrets. Well, here's one of them. The year was 1968. The place? La Palma Island in the Canaries. More specifically, Tazacorte, a small town which many transport ships and fishing vessels called home. One such ship at the time was El Fausto, a ship large enough, sturdy enough, and fast enough that it was used for both fishing and transport purposes. On July 20th of that year, she set sail to El Hierro, another island only 50 miles south of La Palma, bringing with her a cargo of agricultural explosives. 3 experienced sailors were on board. 2 brothers, Ramon and Eliberto Hernandez, and their cousin, Miguel Acosta, all of them in their 40s. The men were familiar with El Fausto, having crewed her many times in the past. After a 7-hour-long journey, El Fausto finally reached its destination and unloaded its delivery. While there, the 3-man crew met a man named Julio Garcia, a fellow native of La Palma. Julio had just gotten word that his daughter back home was extremely sick, and he needed to get back to La Palma as soon as possible. He approached the crew of El Fausto and told them about his predicament. Since the next liner back to La Palma wouldn't depart for another 2 days, the 3 sailors agreed to let Julio come back with them, free of charge. On July 21st, at 2:30 AM, El Fausto and the 4 men set off on another 7-hour voyage back to Tazacorte. Well, those 7 hours passed, and El Fausto still hadn't arrived back home. That wasn't too unusual. They could have been delayed for a number of reasons. But as the hours passed with no sign of the ship or the 4 men aboard her, the sailors' families started to become worried. El Fausto's owner, Rafael Acosta, relative of the 3-man crew, sent another ship out along the exact same route to search for them. Surely this boat would come across the El Fausto on its way, right? Wrong. The waters on the way to El Hierro were clear, and there was no sign of El Fausto sailing back to La Palma. That didn't make any sense. Ramon, Eliberto and Miguel had made that same journey countless times in much harsher conditions. In fact, sailing conditions that day were almost perfect. The sea was calm and visibility clear. There was only one explanation. El Fausto must have gone off route for some reason. But why? El Fausto and her crew were immediately reported missing, and all other vessels in the area were asked to keep an eye out for the ship. Planes were sent to scout the ocean from above. It was only a matter of time before El Fausto was found, everyone thought. That prediction turned out to be overly optimistic. Despite it being a clear day, neither the planes nor any of the other boats in the area found any sign of El Fausto. It was like it had vanished into thin air. A horrible thought occurred to everyone back on La Palma. El Fausto must have sunk. 4 days passed with no updates. Just as everyone was starting to come to terms with the loss of all 4 souls aboard El Fausto, the search and rescue team received some amazing news. A British ship had reportedly just spotted El Fausto, floating 120 miles west of La Palma. How it wound up so far off course was anyone's guess, but the British reported that all 4 men on board were still alive, though obviously a little worse for wear, and said that they'd be happy to tow them back home to Tazacorte. For some bizarre reason, the crew on El Fausto said no thank you. The British were confused, of course, and asked what sort of mechanical problems the ship had suffered. Nothing, replied El Fausto's crew. The boat was fine, their communications were fine, nothing was wrong. All 4 men appeared to be of sound mind and weren't delirious or confused about the situation. They once again rejected the British offer to be towed back home, and instead simply asked for enough fuel to make it back home on their own. The British gave them enough fuel, food and water to sustain them for 18 more hours, more than enough to make the journey back home. When news of this broke back in Tazacorte, the locals all began to celebrate. Their 4 lost sons would be home by sunset. Everyone gathered at the port to welcome back the lost men, including, of course, all their family members. There was drinking, and music, and dancing, and a lot of confusion when the sun finally did set, and there was still no sign of El Fausto. The crew's families waited on the dock all night. By morning, it became clear that the ship was now missing for a second time. Planes and ships were sent from the Spanish mainland, all with one clear objective: find the El Fausto. The government spent over $2 million on the rescue effort, but just like before, the elusive hunk of metal had vanished without a trace. After 2 weeks of searching, they gave up the hunt. It wouldn't be until October 9th, 2.5 months after the ship had first gone missing, that an Italian vessel actually came across El Fausto, floating in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. Nobody was on board. Not Ramon, not Eliberto, not Miguel, not Julio. The ship was in perfect working condition. There were no signs of fighting or damage, no records or logbooks, no indication about what had happened whatsoever. Not on the top deck, at least. One of the Italian crew members climbed down into El Fausto's engine room. What he found inside almost made him throw up. On the floor in front of him was the unclothed, partially mummified body of a man. A radio and notebook were found resting next to him. Many pages in this notebook had been torn out, but one remaining page in particular stood out. Spanish writing covered the page, and whatever it said, it appeared to be the end page of a much longer message. The Italians told the Spanish they would tow El Fausto to Venezuela, and from there would send them all the evidence they had. Here's where another strange twist occurred in the case. 2 days later, the Spanish authorities received a telegram from the Italian ship. According to them, while en route to Venezuela, El Fausto suddenly and inexplicably sunk. The ship had been lost to the sea, taking with it the half-mummified body on board and most of the evidence. Well, that didn't make any sense. The ship was reportedly in perfect condition. How had this happened? Nobody seemed to know. The remaining evidence that was found on El Fausto eventually arrived in La Palma. Julio Garcia's wife recognized the notebook immediately and confirmed that the message had been written in her husband's handwriting, indicating that the body most likely belonged to Julio. He had scrawled a goodbye message to his wife in the notebook, though it was clear that the beginning pages had been removed. The message ended with the cryptic words, "Don't ever tell our children about what happened to me. You know that God wanted this fate for me. Love you." It's clear from those words that Julio knew he was about to lose his life, though since his remains are now somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic, we'll never know how it came to end for sure. Why were the beginning pages of his message missing? What did they say? Did they contain an explanation about what had happened? Where were Ramon, Eliberto, and Miguel? Why had El Fausto been found so far off course? Why did the men reject the help of the British ship that found them? Why did El Fausto itself suddenly sink without any further explanation from the Italians? Why does none of this seem to make any sense? To this day, nobody knows the answers to any of those questions. Many theories have been thrown around, none of them particularly convincing. No matter how you look at it, the mystery of El Fausto doesn't make any sense. With the El Fausto now at the bottom of the sea, the truth about what happened on board will probably never surface. China has more than its fair share of wild and disturbing cases, that's for sure, but here's one that really takes the cake. Shen Changyin and Shen Changping were two brothers who, despite being born 8 years apart, were both extremely close. They did everything together. Work, relax, kill women and eat their livers, travel. The Shens are infamous in their native homeland, but their antics are basically unheard of in the West. So, let's start from the beginning. It all began in 1999. At the time, Chang Yin was 23 and Chang Ping 15. They'd started an auto business together in Lanzhou City, a venture that failed spectacularly. The Shen brothers had lost all of their money and quickly decided that an honest day's work wasn't worth their time or energy. So, rather than getting other jobs to recoup their losses, the brothers took to robbing other local businesses instead. It was in September of '99 when Chang Yin, the eldest Shen brother, took things a step too far and ended up killing a man during a hold-up. This being China, Chang Yin knew that if he was caught, he'd quickly be meeting with the firing squad. As such, he took his victim's money, told his brother what had just happened, and the pair of them fled to the city of Henan. For a time, they laid low and stayed out of trouble, but that turned out merely to be the calm before the real storm. In 2003, the brothers returned to Lanzhou City. While there, they met a woman offering her services on the street. We'll call her woman number 1. They paid this woman to come back to their apartment with them. Once inside, the brothers tied her up, took her credit and debit cards, and forced her to give them the PIN numbers. If she didn't do what they said, they would kill her. Of course, she told them. It didn't matter. The brothers killed her all the same by squeezing her neck till all the life in her was snuffed out. They then dismembered her body and disposed of her somewhere in the city. It's unclear whether this was the first time the brothers had pulled such a stunt, but it certainly wasn't the last. 5 months later, the Shen brothers employed the service of another girl on the street. Woman number 2, Li Chunling. Just like before, they paid Li to come back to their apartment for a fun and profitable night. She entered and was immediately tied up and ordered to give them her PIN numbers. Li knew that if she complied, she was as good as dead. Instead of begging for her life, however, she made a deal with the Shens. If they let her go, she promised to return with more victims for them. For some reason, the brothers were convinced by her words. They untied her and let her go, telling her to come back soon with some gullible fresh meat. You're probably thinking she must have been a good actress to talk her way out of that situation. Thing is, she wasn't acting. A few days later, Li really did return to the brothers' apartment with a new victim, woman number 3. Why Li actually did this remains a mystery. The Shen brothers had tricked her into their clutches and were going to take her life, but when she was released and physically apart from them, for some bizarre reason, she didn't run to the police. Even more bizarrely, she was actually now helping them. Woman number 3 was bound and her cards taken. The Shen brothers then ordered Li to kill her. Li obliged. Once number 3 was dead, the Shens cut out one of her kidneys, buried it outside, and then dissolved her body in acid until they could successfully flush her down the toilet. From here on out, Li decided to team up with the Shen brothers. The reason for this is unclear. Perhaps they had made a deal with her, offering her a cut of the money they took from each of their victims. Perhaps they had some dirt on her and were blackmailing her into compliance. Perhaps she was just scared. Whatever the case, the duo were now a trio, and even though Li was free to leave the apartment by herself and hunt for new victims, she never once tried to contact the authorities or simply run away and go into hiding. It's not like the brothers would have been able to find her. Still, she played her part, and over the next 5 months, the 3 musketeers, or more fittingly mutilators, robbed and killed 3 more women. The exact details of these slayings haven't been reported on, but it's safe to assume they were all similar to the previous ones. Now here's where things get really messed up. Li and the Shen brothers left Lanzhou City and moved into an apartment together in Taiyuan, a different city over 600 miles away. Maybe things were getting too hot in Lanzhou, and they needed a new base of operations. While there, they hired yet another woman to come to their home. Woman number 7, Zhao Meiying. When she arrived, Li and the brothers forced her to call another woman to come over, a sort of takeout service worker. This worker, woman number 8, promptly arrived. Big mistake. She was quickly tied up, and Zhao was given a blade and told that she had to slay her colleague. It was either that or be slain herself. She chose the former option, and the takeout worker was taken out. After woman number 8 had been slashed to pieces, Zhao was told to dispose of her in a meat processor. That's right, their latest victim was turned into human sausages, which were subsequently flushed down the toilet. Just like Li, Zhao joined up with the Shens, helping them slaughter their way from rags to riches. Together, the 4 of them moved from city to city, claiming lives and credit cards as they went. With each new kill, they moved to a new city in a different prefecture, making it extremely difficult for the authorities to link all of the cases together. During this time, both Li and Zhao were given a lot of autonomy and were free to go off on their own and do whatever they pleased with their downtime. It was clear that they weren't being held captive, so why did they decide to stay with the brothers? After slaying 3 more women, the gang ended up in the city of Shijiazhuang and got themselves a new apartment. This is where things started to unravel. While they were there, something made Zhao snap. Either she had had enough of her part in all this chaos, or the Shen brothers had pushed things too far, or she was denied a cut of the money, Or she suddenly developed a conscience. We don't know, but she did finally decide to go to the police. She told them everything that had happened, including the part that she had played. The cops quickly paid a visit to the Shen's apartment. They found Li inside. She was arrested and eventually confessed to everything as well. The Shen brothers, however, were nowhere to be seen. Despite the authorities actively looking for them, Shen Changyin and Shen Changping remained in the city of Shijiaoshuang and even managed to get themselves 2 more female henchmen, Du Su Rong, 23, and an unnamed female, only 16. After receiving an anonymous tip in August 2004, the cops raided the apartment where the Shen brothers were now living. Inside, they found the pair of them, along with Du Su Rong and their unnamed accomplice. They were in the middle of dissolving another victim, literally caught in the act. The stolen bank cards of 11 known victims were found during a search of their apartment. The Shen brothers confessed to everything. The robberies, the murders, the disposals. Heck, they even took things a step further and confessed to eating the livers of most of their victims. They said that their motive for doing all of this wasn't money. It was simply because they were, quote-unquote, evil. Yeah, not exactly building a strong defense case for themselves. Unsurprisingly, they were found guilty. They all were, in fact. Li, Zhao, Du, and the unnamed youngster. The 4 female accomplices got 20 years apiece. The Shen brothers were sentenced to death. They faced the firing squad in 2005, and in a volley, the Shen brothers' reign of terror finally came to an end. They were 29 and 21, respectively. Although this case has officially been solved, there are still so many unanswered questions that just baffle me. Most obviously, why did all of their accomplices join forces with the self-described evil brothers? I know they must have been scared, but they were all allowed to roam freely, and they always returned to the Shens rather than running away and calling for help. Perhaps they all feared the repercussions of their actions, and were bound to the brothers that way. Maybe the brothers have filmed them when they forced them to kill their victims, giving them leverage over them. This being China, there isn't much documentation on their side of the story, meaning we're all left to speculate about why they didn't all make a run for it when they had the chance. Another thing we just don't know is how many victims the Shens actually had. Sure, all the accomplices have confessed to the slayings that they were a part of, but the Shens may have been active well before coming into contact with any of them. They may have had other accomplices before them as well, or maybe even killed other people when their accomplices weren't around. The answers to all of these questions, and many others pertaining to this case, remain unknown to the general public, and are likely to remain unknown forevermore. On the 3rd of January 2006, Dana Dostal was making her way home after finishing work as a bank teller in nearby Lake Isabella, California. She and her 34-year-old boyfriend, Dale Hay, lived with his young son in the small valley town of Weldon, a peaceful community of less than 3,000 residents. Weldon is often teeming with fishermen during the day, but is relatively quiet during twilight hours, and has an extremely low crime rate. It's this low crime rate that made the events of January 3rd so shocking. Events that would change Dana's life forever. Because, as she drove down a particularly isolated stretch of Kelso Creek Road, Dana noticed the driver of a strange pickup truck behaving suspiciously while at the wheel. Dana later described the vehicle as a light-coloured, full-size pickup truck with a camper shell that was a shade lighter than the chassis.
So I just remember the blaring bright lights, behind me. And I got to a part in the road where I was just like, this guy has to go around me. I couldn't see. So I slowed down real slow. And the truck went around me and kind of like slammed on his brakes in front of me. It seemed kind of like a cat and mouse. If I sped up a little bit, he was right on my tail, and I slowed down and he didn't pass. It just stayed, behind me.
Naturally, the strange driver's behaviour made Dana extremely anxious, and the last thing she wanted to do was lead them back to her house. In response, she began to perform some impromptu, evasive driving maneuvers, feinting turns, turning back on herself, or speeding up around some dangerous blind bends in order to put some distance between her and the faceless stalker. It was a risky move, but it paid off, and soon she couldn't see any pursuing headlights in her rearview mirror. Satisfied that she had escaped the truck driver, Dana returned to her home, shaken by the encounter, but glad she had avoided any potential danger. Yet, as she pulled into her driveway, Dana saw a pair of headlights appear at the entrance to her street. No, she thought. It can't be. But it was, and as the truck got closer, she realized it was the exact same vehicle that had been following her. Stricken with panic, Dana parked her vehicle, scrambled out of the driver's side door, and bolted towards her house. Having heard Dana's arrival, Dale's 9-year-old son ran to the front door to greet her, and, according to him, the strange truck drove off as soon as the driver laid eyes on him. By this point, Dana was inconsolable and wept openly as she described the harrowing ordeal to her boyfriend. Dale was her rock. He had never failed her before, and he didn't fail her then. He assured Dana that he'd protect her no matter what. Despite being profoundly frightened by the incident, Dale's reassurance seemed to have worked because the couple then resumed their evening chores. The way Dana remembers it, she got on with doing the laundry while Dale cooked dinner. A kind of uneasy peace had descended on the household, but it was one that was shattered by the word of Dale's young son. "Dad, there's someone outside the house." The couple walked into the front room of their home and saw a large truck that had parked facing the house. It was flashing its lights through the window. It was a sight that must have made Dana's blood run cold. She thought she was rid of this truck driver who had been following her, but now they were back, and they were taunting her. Dale was of course furious. He'd promised to protect Dana, and he meant every word of it. He stormed outside of the house with such ferocity that the truck driver sped off as soon as he emerged. Yet, just a short while later, they again returned. Still apoplectic with rage, Dale marched right out into the front yard, and as the truck driver tried to escape again, Dale began to follow them in his Jeep. Dale's young son, Willie, was getting more and more frightened by the minute, and with his father now gone, it was getting increasingly difficult to calm him down. As a distraction, Dana put on a movie for her and Willie to watch. This worked for a while, but as more and more time went by, Dana became increasingly worried for her boyfriend's well-being. When the movie had ended, and Dale still hadn't returned home, Dana and Willie climbed into her car and went out searching for the boy's father. She'd barely driven a mile from the property when she discovered his Jeep crashed into a farmer's fence. Dale was slumped over in the driver's seat with a single gunshot wound to his head. He was rushed to the hospital, but was sadly pronounced dead on arrival. Given the circumstances, investigating officers quickly concluded that Dale had been murdered by the truck-driving stalker he'd been chasing off, but discovering exactly who that person was would prove to be nigh impossible. By all accounts, Dale was a kind, patient, and well-liked man in the community. He and Dana led peaceful, quiet lives, and she couldn't think of a single person who might harbour violent intent for them. Yet, at the same time, their hometown of Weldon is an incredibly isolated place, with the nearest city being almost 50 miles away. As Dana puts it, everybody knows everybody. You can't rob a bank there because you're gonna get caught. That's the kind of mindset I had. There's no escaping from the valley because you're surrounded by mountains and got nowhere to go, so why would you commit a crime here? The residents of Weldon tried to comfort themselves with the idea that it was some malevolent stranger that had killed Dale. But in reality, it was probably someone they knew. Someone terrifyingly close to them. Maybe even one of their own neighbors. Sadly, investigators were unable to uncover any significant leads in the case, and it essentially turned cold in the years following 2006, when the last known tip was called into the police. As the years go by, it seems less and less likely that Dale's killer will ever be brought to justice. A person so entitled that they felt they could stalk a young woman down a dark country road before murdering a loved one when he dared attempt to defend her. The fact that such a morally hideous person is free to walk the streets is enough to make your blood boil, but let it serve as a reminder that we must remain steadfastly vigilant in the face of such predatory evil. The year was 1976. The place? Otterbein, a small, rural town in Benton County, Indiana. It was home to the Skoogs, a farming family who owned 40 acres of corn along Benton County Road 200 South. That evening, the family's son, Curtis Skoog, was outside mowing the lawn when he saw his father, Norman, and his grandfather, Everett, pull up in the driveway in the eldest man's pickup truck. In the bed of the pickup was a white cardboard box, which had been sealed shut with furnace tape and tied tightly with clothesline. While out harvesting in a remote area about 1.5 miles away from the family home, Norman had come across the mysterious box, which somebody had left deep within the cornfield. Strange. The box was blocking the path of his combine, so he hopped out to move it. He quickly realized that the box was far too heavy for one man to lift alone. That's when he called his father-in-law, Everett, and together they loaded it into Everett's pickup and brought it back to the house to open it up. They untied the line, cut open the tape, and together the 3 generations of men made one horrifying discovery. Inside the box, wrapped in layers of plastic, was what appeared to be something in the shape of a human. There was a broken vial of perfume resting on top of it. Immediately, they all knew that something wasn't right. Sheriff Donald Steely came to inspect the strange package. He peeled back the layers of heavy plastic, and all at once, a disgusting odor hit all of their nostrils. It was the smell of death. Wrapped up like a morbid Christmas present was the body of a woman in the fetal position. Rope bound her body together. Her head was wrapped in paper towels and trash can liners. She was partially decomposed, and the perfume had clearly been used to mask the odors. They estimated she'd been dead for between 7 and 10 days. This was a grisly discovery for sure, and the first order of business was to figure out who this woman was. That shouldn't take too long, thought the officers. Although the woman had no ID on her, she was clearly around 50 or 60 years old, and surely she had some family out there looking for her. It was only a matter of time before they matched her with a missing persons report and somebody came to identify her. Well, that's the thing. No one came forward to claim her remains, meaning that the woman remained unidentified. Whoever she was, it was clear nobody was missing her. This made the authorities' jobs much harder and gave them very little to work with. The perps in most murder cases are a spouse, a close relative, or a friend of the victim, but without knowing who she was, investigators were left scratching their heads as to who to question. If the strange nature in which this woman was disposed of didn't give it away, it was now glaringly obvious to the authorities that this wasn't going to be their typical case. They named her the Box Lady of Benton County. A sketch of the Benton County Doe's face was drawn up and was made public, along with a description of the scene and a number of specific details about her. She had brownish grey hair and brown eyes, was 5 foot 2 inches tall, weighed around 160 pounds, and was wearing light green trousers and a light green shirt which were in good condition. She wasn't wearing any shoes, jewellery, or makeup. Her distinguishing facial features included an upturned nose, as well as abnormally large ears for her small face. A scar ran from her sternum to her stomach. Her hands were covered in calluses. She was fingerprinted, but didn't match with anyone on the police's database, meaning that she had never been arrested and that she was born in the USA. Still, that didn't help narrow things down much. After an autopsy, it was determined that somebody had shot the doe in the back of the head with a shotgun. Detectives started to theorize why somebody would do that to the poor woman, and then so heartlessly pack her into a box and dump her in a farmer's cornfield. The calluses on her hands suggested that she may have been a cleaning lady. If that's the case, then perhaps she saw something or heard something that she wasn't supposed to at a client's house, and was subsequently silenced. They started to wonder if this could be mob-related. Even with the police actively appealing for leads, the woman's remains went unclaimed, and her identity remained a mystery. As such, they buried her in an unmarked grave and turned their focus to the only other piece of evidence they had: the box itself. They came to the conclusion that the box had been manufactured in Chicago, and believed that's where the woman must have been from. So, they figured they knew where the box had come from. Now the question was, how did it come to be in a cornfield in Benton County? The spot where the box was discovered was far away from any roads, and there was no evidence of broken corn stems leading up to its location, suggesting that nobody had dragged it into the field. Despite it raining the evening prior, the box itself was completely dry, meaning that it had been dumped there very recently. As strange as it sounds, the main theory is that it was dropped there via helicopter. None of the other farmers in the area reported seeing or hearing any cars in the lead up to the box's discovery, and given how rural this area is, that's the sort of thing these busy outdoorsmen tend to notice. There were reports of a helicopter in the area, however. According to 3 different witnesses, they saw a chopper hovering near the ground around the area where the box was later discovered. There was also a circular imprint at the scene, which could have easily been made by a chopper's updraft. If that's the case, I'd say it definitely supports the theory that some rich and powerful individuals are responsible for what happened to the box lady. Pretty crazy to think about. In an effort to give the woman back her name, Benton County Doe's remains were dug up in 2019 and her DNA was collected. No matches were found. As of right now, it's been 45 years, and we don't even know the box lady's identity, let alone the identity of the person or persons who took her life. Who was she? Who were they? And why did they do what they did? It's sad to think that nobody was out looking for our Doe. No family, no friends. Surely somebody out there knows who this lady was. Perhaps one day they'll come forward with information. Until that day, she'll remain the box lady of Benton County, buried without a name or headstone, alive in people's memories, not for who she was in life, but for how her life ended. "Hi Walter, I got a new girlfriend today," is referring to a video on YouTube, originally uploaded in 2009 by 2150 Studios. The re-upload is currently sitting at 1.5 million views. The video starts out normal enough, with a young man sitting alone in a room, talking to the camera. But he's not addressing his entire audience. He's specifically talking to someone called Walter, as if this video was uploaded just for him. The man explains how he had just met the most amazing girl at the mall that day, and describes how he went shopping with her at JCPenney's and a jewelry shop. With a voice that's struggling to hold back excitement, the man says that he brought this girl back to his place. "I know she hates cameras, Walter, but I'm gonna show you her anyways. You ready?" The video suddenly cuts to a different area of the house. We're now in some dingy basement. The man opens a door to reveal a tied-up woman cowering in the corner of a small bathroom, crying and desperately begging for help. The man enters the room and slams the door behind him. The woman screams, and the video ends abruptly. This upload got a lot of people talking. A young woman named Kayla Berg had gone missing at the time the video went live, and some viewers noticed that the girl in the bathroom looked a lot like her. Fearing that this was more than just a joke, several viewers actually contacted the police about the video, and the owners of the YouTube channel were investigated. Kayla's own mother even watched the video, and said, quote, "It sounded like her, looked like her. It gave me chills." It appeared as if there had just been a massive development in the case. The video started being reported on by the media, and the comment section of the video was now filled with outrage. This prompted the owners of the channel to leave this comment on one of their other videos. "We apologize for any emotional harm caused by Hi Walter, I Got a New Girlfriend Today, produced back in 2009. There was no intention of it resembling any real person or event. The actors involved wish to extend their sympathies to the mother of Kayla Berg, and sincere apologies for the emotional turmoil it caused." So as it turns out, this whole video was just an art piece designed to drum up interest in their YouTube channel. It had nothing to do with Kayla Berg, and it was just a coincidence that the actress resembled her. But imagine seeing this before it was confirmed to be a hoax. I mean, the guy's actually a pretty good actor. He sells the part, and makes you believe that he really is some unhinged, nerdy guy who just snapped one day. The fact that he's addressing some guy called Walter makes the video appear more personal as well, like this was some sort of revenge video. But although this video did turn out to be fake, and the creators obviously didn't intend to cause any harm, a lot of people really thought this was real back in the day, and it's extremely unfortunate that Kayla Berg's mother was amongst them. The year was 2016. Narumi Kurosaki was a 21-year-old who had just been accepted as an exchange student at the University of Franche-Comté, Besançon, France. An adventurous girl, she'd always wanted to study overseas and experience living in other cultures. Her dream was about to come true. In September of that year, she arrived in France and began her studies. It was set to be an exciting experience, a new chapter in her life. Unfortunately, it was also set to be its final chapter. Only 2 months after arriving in Besançon, Narumi's professors started to become concerned when she stopped showing up to her classes. Her housemates were equally perplexed. They hadn't seen Narumi since December 4th. They assumed that she was staying with someone else, or had taken a trip without telling anyone. They tried to contact her, but to no avail. Not sure what else to do, they reported Narumi missing. An investigation into her vanishing began immediately, and from the beginning, things looked bleak. Narumi hadn't used her mobile phone or bank cards since December 4th, the last night anyone had seen her alive. Detectives questioned Narumi's housemates, hoping they might be able to offer some insight into what happened to the young Japanese national. One fellow student, who lived on the ground floor alongside Narumi, reported that she heard a scream of terror and a struggle in the middle of the night on December 4th, but said that when she looked out of her door down the hallway, she saw nobody. Assuming it was just college students being college students and making a lot of noise, she thought nothing more of it and went back to bed. Investigators combed Narumi's room for evidence. Just outside, they found a red splattering on a fire escape door. It couldn't be determined whether this was blood or not, but they immediately suspected the worst. On December 26th, despite nobody ever being found, the authorities were confident enough to declare that Narumi Kurosaki had been murdered. And what's more, they had a prime suspect. Nicolas Cepeda Contreras, a then 26-year-old from Chile. Nicolas was Narumi's ex-boyfriend. The pair had actually met in Japan when Nicolas was an assistant teacher, but had broken up before Narumi went to study in France. Nicolas himself had gone back to Chile, and it's unclear exactly why the pair split. So Nicolas lived in Chile and Narumi died in France. Explain, Lazy. Gladly. Shortly before Narumi went missing, Nicolas had flown out to Besançon. The pair had apparently reconnected. They were caught on a restaurant's CCTV camera eating dinner together. Later that evening, they were both again caught on camera, entering Narumi's apartment building. Sometime later, Nicolas was captured, leaving the complex alone. Soon after, he caught a plane back to Chile. It's assumed that he dragged Narumi's remains through the building's fire exit, an exit which wasn't monitored by cameras. He then threw her into the back of his rented car, which was later returned covered in mud, and went and buried her in a local forest. He then fled the country, and from his computer in Chile, sent messages to Narumi's friends, trying to explain her absence away. An international arrest warrant for Nicolas was issued, but due to extradition difficulties, and the fact that the young man was from a very wealthy, very influential family in Chile, getting him arrested and brought back to France was very difficult. As such, 2 French investigators flew out to Chile themselves to question him. This sadly proved to be a waste of everyone's time, since the guy refused to answer any of the 95 questions posed to him. The only thing Nicolas declared publicly was that he was innocent, and that he believed Narumi was still alive. Yeah, Nicolas. That made a lot of sense, seeing how nobody had seen or heard from her since December 4th, 2016, not even her family, and that you just so happened to be in France with her on the night she disappeared. But let's give Nicolas the benefit of the doubt. let's just for a minute assume that he really did fly halfway around the world to meet his ex-girlfriend, have one final goodbye dinner, for old time's sake, and that the fact she hasn't been seen since entering her accommodation building with him is purely coincidental. Even assuming all that, there's still one huge, damning piece of evidence that was uncovered on YouTube of all places. Back in September 2016, around the time Narumi had flown to France, Nicholas had uploaded a video onto YouTube in which he addressed Narumi directly. In the video, he gave Narumi until September 21st to comply with a set of conditions which were designed to, quote-unquote, save their relationship. "She cannot be making such mistakes with someone who loves her," he said in the video. "Some conditions concern her stay in France, others apply forever." It's unclear what he meant exactly, but whatever the case, after Narumi disappeared in December, he quickly took the video down. It later resurfaced after being re-uploaded by a Japanese user who took an interest in the case. So, there's our possible motive. Jealousy. If Nicholas couldn't have her, nobody could. Since an extradition request can only be made once, the French authorities had to take their time collecting evidence and making as strong a case as possible so that they could get Nicholas brought back to France. In July 2020, he was finally extradited. His trial is set to begin this autumn, and, if found guilty, he faces life in a French prison. October 3rd, 2005, east of Seminole, Alabama. Just off Highway 90, a group of highway workers made a grisly discovery in a remote wooded area. They came across a toolbox, 2 by 3 feet in size, abandoned in the forest. They were curious about what could be inside this supposed treasure chest. After all, it's not exactly the kind of thing you come across every day. Naturally, they all gathered around and opened the thing up. The smell hit them before they could look upon their find. In the toolbox was a decaying, red mass of flesh. They all thought it was an animal carcass at first. Then they noticed it was wearing pants, a belt, and a shirt. Stuffed inside this small box was a fully grown man. A wallet was found inside the sticky, decaying remains. An ID card within identified the corpse as Kenneth Clay Pierce, a 44-year-old from Kentucky. Judging from how decomposed he was, forensics estimated that he must have been dead for at least a month. Countless cars had driven past the woods during that time, the drivers and passengers completely unaware that Kenneth's remains were right there, discarded on the side of the road like a piece of trash. It was determined that the 5'8", 160-pound Kenneth was killed before he was stuffed into the box. A fracture on his skull suggested that he had been killed by a blow to the head, a strike likely made by a baseball bat. Like so many others before and after him, nobody came forward to claim Kenneth's body. No friends, no family. It seemed like the guy was nothing to no one. If there hadn't been any ID in his wallet, then it'd probably still be a John Doe. Not only would his life have been taken, but also his entire identity. He still had that at least, and that gave detectives a lot to work with. They started by examining who Kenneth Clay Pierce actually was. For the past 13 years, the 44-year-old had been living in Pensacola, Florida, living what appeared to be a nomadic life. The guy had no fixed job and no fixed address. He seemed to just wander from place to place, sometimes living in a house, sometimes on the streets. His last known job had been clearing debris after Hurricane Ivan. He had no family to speak of, and no other assets to help the authorities piece together his backstory. Flyers were put up all around the city, appealing for people to come forward with information about who Kenneth was, about how he came to meet such a gruesome fate. Nobody came forward. From what investigators could gather, Kenneth didn't keep the best of company. The guy hung out with some bad people, and was known to be a heavy drinker. He was also known to regularly hit up clubs and bars in Pensacola, as well as the local shelter. After learning about his life, the authorities came to the conclusion that Kenneth must have been slain in Pensacola for whatever reason, and then driven out to Seminole, where he was dumped. That brings us to the toolbox in which Kenneth was found. With no other physical evidence to speak of, this toolbox proved to be the most vital lead of all. The thing was homemade, crafted from corrugated plastic, and not just any old plastic. Detectives were able to pinpoint exactly where the material had come from. The top of a commercial dumpster, the kind you see outside of businesses. Close to the shelter where Kenneth used to sometimes stay, investigators found another toolbox inside the back of a pickup truck belonging to a local resident. The top of this toolbox was also homemade, and apart from its colour, it was identical in every way to the one that Kenneth was discovered in. This was a big break. The owner of the truck was tracked down and questioned, the cops hopeful that they had found their perp. Unfortunately, they were unable to come up with any evidence proving that this man was responsible for Kenneth's demise, or even that the two had previously met. It seems likely that if this guy had the same style homemade toolbox, he either made it himself or knew who sold it to him. Still, this break didn't lead anywhere, and it's possible that the toolbox in which Kenneth was found was stolen. That might explain why no connection could be made. Either way, the police had hit a dead end, and unfortunately, no new leads have presented themselves since. The case is no closer to being cracked now than it was 15 years ago. The only thing the cops are sure of is that more than one person is responsible for taking Kenneth's life. It certainly shocks the conscience a little bit to think that there are people out there who have beat someone to death, put them in a box, and literally thrown them out on the side of the road, said Andre Reed with the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office. And that's why I say it's important that we make an arrest in this case, because what kind of people are those? Kenneth Clay Pierce was buried in Baldwin County, while 5 strangers attended his service. Just another forgotten man. Well, that forgotten man remains in the minds of strangers all around the world who have heard his case and have delved into its rabbit hole. Who killed Kenneth Pierce, and what were their motives? All we know for certain is that somebody out there knows the truth. Who knows? Maybe they're watching. A much more grounded mystery with a spacey context for this one. Founded by a man called Edward Mielnik back in 1990, Antrovis was a Polish cult that held some very strange beliefs, to say the least. According to Mielnik, 8 billion years ago, Earth was visited by 2 spaceships, one of them containing the Slavic peoples, who originally come from the planet Atlanta. Like many other cultists, the followers of Antrovis wholeheartedly believe that the world was soon about to end, and that the only way to survive the apocalypse was by escaping in their Slavic spaceship. In their minds, the aliens would return in their ship just before the Earth's destruction, save the dedicated Antrovis members from certain death, and take them to the planet Marinda. Thing is, the alien spaceship needed to be powered somehow, and the only fuel source was the energy found within the people of Central Europe. Apparently, World War II was some sort of plot to kill as many Central Europeans as possible, so that the guy with the Chaplin mustache, no, the other one, could escape Earth with all his friends. Pretty crazy stuff. Anyway, it was the early 90s. Antrovis was certain the end was nigh, and that their alien spacecraft would soon arrive. They needed to get their hands on some of that sweet, sweet spaceship power quickly, or else they'd all be doomed. How did they plan to harvest that power? By giving up their body parts. Many members started to mutilate themselves in order to help power the ship. Many male members cut off the parts of themselves that contain the most powerful energy, namely their family jewels. Oh, it hurts to even say it. What they actually did with these chopped off bits remains unclear. Now, from an outsider's perspective looking in, this could all seem darkly comical. But here's where things turn from darkly comical to darkly tragic. In their quest to harvest as much energy as possible, it seems Antrovis may have turned to murder. In August of 1993, Andrei Sialecki, 18, vanished on his way to school, never to be seen again. Because of his interest in ufology, the young man had gotten heavily involved with Antrovis, and over time, his parents noticed that his behavior was becoming weirder and weirder. He'd sit alone in his room for hours meditating, ignoring his schoolwork and friends. Over time, he started to show signs of fear and agitation, saying that he thought someone was out to get him. He stopped sleeping and barely ate any food because he was so worried someone was trying to poison him. Not long afterwards, he went missing. Though many suspect Antravis were responsible, no concrete evidence was ever found linking the group to Andre's disappearance. Around the same sort of time, another young man, only 16, also vanished. He too had links to Antravis. The group liked to recruit younger, more impressionable members, much to the behest of the inductees' parents. In 1995, a PE teacher and fellow member of Antravis also disappeared. His remains were actually found in the Odra River. His head had been battered in, and someone had removed his manhood with surgical precision. 2 surgeons who were members of Antravis were questioned, but the authorities were unable to link them to the teacher's demise, and the case went cold. Though all 3 of these cases are still technically unsolved, it's strongly suspected that Antravis were responsible for the teacher's death, and that the 2 aforementioned boys suffered the same fate at the hands of its members. Though Antravis has since formally disbanded, it's believed that they still unofficially exist in Poland in an underground capacity. Since it's extremely common for cult members to become estranged from their families and friends, it's very likely more people were selected for involuntary harvest, their sudden and mysterious disappearances simply never reported. Question is, how many? Three Orangutans, One Blender refers to a rare online video that few people have ever seen, but those who have watched it say it's one of the most disturbing clips in existence. Rumours about 3 orangutans started spreading all the way back in 2008, when YouTuber Damanico uploaded the first ever reaction video to it. In the years that followed, many more reactions to 3 orangutans were uploaded to YouTube. In all of them, the reactor appears disgusted by what they're seeing. The same hip-hop music can be heard in the background of each reaction, along with the same screaming ape noises, suggesting that all of these reactors were watching the same video. As for what the footage is actually of, the most famous account comes from a guy called Roberto Martinez. He made an extremely long post about the contents of the video, so I'll just give the SparkNotes version here. 3 Orangutans, One Blender is a real video that can now be found on the dark web. It was published during 2006, but wasn't found until later. Here's what it is. So the music makes it sound like it's okay, but the video is horrifying. In the video, there are these Indian or Brazilian army men wearing yellowish, greenish camouflage. They walk into a building and take beaten, damaged, caged orangutans and brutally cut them up with machetes, then begin pouring bleach and what looks like lemon juice all over them before shoving them into this weird machine that is definitely not a blender. It's this big machine that has blades that spin like a blender, but it's not. The machine has no roof, but it has a balcony with rails that circle around the top, and 2 steel platforms on both sides above the machine, going across to the other side like a bridge. Whatever it is, it brutally slices some of the orangutans into a bloodbath of pieces, while leaving some still alive, screaming in agony and pain, while some of the men are laughing. Then, this fat guy in a yellow camouflage ski mask comes inside the machine and uses a chainsaw to butcher 6 of them. They take the last 3 male orangutans and walk them into a cabin-like shelter where there are 3 tigers waiting. They have the tigers slowly eat and rip off the private parts of these orangutans. They throw the orangutans on the ground, taking turns pouring some lemon juice on them, before brutally butchering them while laughing, and throwing the pieces of their carcasses back into the machine and slicing it all up. The video ends there. I think the only reason it's called 3 Orangutans, One Blender is because only 3 of them last to the end. The video was so gruesome that it became harder to find on the ClearNet. You can also see that there are human remains inside the machine with the orangutans. There are 97 men and 19 orangutans counted in the video. Some of the men are shirtless, showing off their tattoos. It's so messed up, you'll wish those guys were dead. Also, all of the men have a strange symbol on their hats or shoulders. The video appears to take place at a camp in the middle of the jungle during the afternoon, with trucks, sheds, and cabins in the background. The original video was 3 hours long and didn't have music, but the video you'll find is only 1 minute and 50 seconds long and has a weird hip-hop beat that covers everything except for the screams of the orangutans and the sound of the machine. Even though the video was posted in 2006, it has a 70s, 80s, or 90s quality. I'm guessing the real thing took place decades ago. Anyways, you're welcome. But seriously, don't watch it. Okay, so that's some extremely disturbing imagery. But you'll be happy to hear that no matter how hard you try, you'll never actually be able to track this video down. That's because 3 orangutans, 1 blender is a myth, just like the Baby Burger video it's based off. No such clip exists. All of the reaction videos to it simply made use of the same beat, giving the illusion that the clip actually existed. Roberto's account of the video was just him playing along with the hoax too. In fact, there are plenty of accounts about what this video actually contains, and they all say something different. As dark as some of those fake stories are, my personal favourite is that it's just a video of someone preparing a smoothie for 3 excited orangutans. Kind of wholesome. At around midnight, on the evening of the 21st of August, 1968, 29-year-old masonry worker Antonio Lobianco and 32-year-old Barbara Locci were driving through a small town about 7 miles west of Florence, Italy. Asleep in the back seat was Barbara's 6-year-old son, Natalino. But when a sharp jolt suddenly woke the boy up, he opened his eyes to a truly horrifying sight. The car he had been sleeping in had crashed, and behind a cracked and splintered windshield, Antonio and his mother, Barbara, lay slumped in their seats, both of them riddled with bullets that leaked fresh blood onto the upholstery. Natalino then descended into a state of shock, because, the way he describes it, he just ran, instinctually fleeing the scene to escape the mind-shattering trauma. Next thing he knew, it was almost 2 AM, and he was 2 kilometers away, knocking at the home of a complete stranger. This stranger said that he was awoken by the sound of a small boy crying, "Open the door and let me in. I'm sleepy and my daddy is sick in bed. Then you have to drive me home because my mother and my uncle are dead in their car." You see, Antonio Lobianco, the man who had been driving the car, wasn't Natalino's father. He was a paramour of his mother, Barbara, one of her many boyfriends. Barbara was a married woman, but was well known for having multiple love affairs throughout her marriage. Her husband, and Natalino's biological father, was a man named Stefano Mele. Naturally, Italian homicide detectives suspected Stefano of being the murderer, with jealousy being his motive, but a lack of evidence forced them to turn to some less than savoury means to obtain a conviction. When Natalino knocked on the stranger's door, he said that his father was sick in bed on the night of the murder, but now he was saying that his father was present at the scene. Now it's entirely possible that Natalino changed his story on his own, but it's believed that the police coached him into saying this. Stefano himself had a hard time proving this wasn't true, and a regional prosecutor made such a strong case to a scandal-hungry jury that, in the end, Stefano was declared guilty and sentenced to 18 years in prison. It appeared to be an open and shut case, a classic example of a jealous lover's crime of passion. But 6 years into Stefano's sentence, the murder of another couple would exonerate him entirely. On the night of September 15th, 1974, 19-year-old bartender Pasquale Gentilcore had driven out to a quiet country lane near the small town of Borgo San Lorenzo, about 12 miles northeast of Florence. He was accompanied by his 18-year-old accountant girlfriend, Stefania Pettini. By all accounts, the two of them were very much in love, and often visited a popular discotheque known as Teen Club. Friends later said that they were usually jolly and carefree, but on the night of September 15th, the couple appeared to be extremely tense. When they were asked what was bothering them, Stefania told her friend that a few days prior, a strange man had followed her during a driving lesson. She had forgotten about it soon after, but had spotted that same man earlier that evening, almost as if he was stalking her. When asked what the man looked like, Stefania could only give a vague description, but added that there was something about this man that she found terrifying. The couple departed the teen club earlier than usual, before driving out to a quiet country lane. This particular roadway wasn't exactly uninhabited, as it was a stretch of road that was known by the locals as something of a lover's lane, a place where young couples could escape to in order to get some privacy and intimacy. Upon their arrival, Stefania and Pasquale found there were a handful of other cars lining the lane. Some of these other couples would later report that some strange men had visited the area on foot, but whether or not they were responsible for what followed is pure speculation. The fact of the matter is that the following morning, Stefania and Pasquale were found shot to death in their car. But it was the condition of Stefania's corpse that people found truly horrifying. After being shot, Stefania had been dragged from the vehicle before being mutilated with almost 100 separate stab wounds. Her killer seemed to have become lost in a frenzy, plunging the blade into her face, neck and chest over and over again before disemboweling her entirely. Once she had been mutilated beyond recognition, Stefania's killer violated her with a grapevine stalk, then left her body on display to be stumbled upon by some unfortunate member of the public, forever condemned to be haunted by that harrowing sight. The police quickly discovered that the gun used to execute both Stefania and Pasquale shared the exact same ballistic patterns as the one used to kill Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locci, thus exonerating Stefano Mele. But one man's answered prayer became another man's problem, and to the Italian police, the prospect of a serial killer was most definitely not a welcome one. The killer had proven that he was brutally effective, but he also demonstrated a terrifying level of patience and discipline. It would be almost 7 years before he struck again, this time on June 6, 1981. 30-year-old warehouse worker Giovanni Foggi and his 21-year-old fiancée Carmela Danuccio would fall victim to the man who came to be known as Il Monstro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. Much like their other murders, the killer targeted his victims late at night while they were alone in their car. He ambushed them with shots from his signature .22 pistol. Then, just as he had done with the previous female victim, he pulled her from the car and began to mutilate her. Only this time, the Monster of Florence began to experiment with a kind of calling card, a sign-off, just to let the police know they had a serial killer on their hands. He took out a notched knife, pulled up Carmela Danuccio's skirt, then cut out her pelvic region entirely before carrying it away as a terrifying trophy. The following morning, a man named Enzo Spalletti apparently started talking about the murders before the bodies had officially been discovered. And this was all it took for the Italian police to seek their second false conviction, with Enzo being jailed for 3 months before finally being cleared of suspicion. The Monster of Florence had waited almost 7 long years to kill again, but it appears his bloodlust was only growing with age, because, unlike his previous murders, which all seemed to fully sate whatever deprived desire drove him to kill, the murders of Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Danuccio didn't seem to quench his thirst for gore, and it took just a matter of months before he once again went on the hunt. 26-year-old labourer Stefano Boldi and his fiancée Susanna Cambi were due to be married in November of 1981. They never got the chance to exchange their vows though, as in October they were both shot and stabbed in the small Tuscan town of Calenzano. Much like before, Cambi's pelvic region had been severely mutilated, and the killer had evidently taken a large section of flesh as a trophy. The killer's next attack, in June of 1982, perhaps makes him more befitting of the name, the Tuscan Ripper, as, just like his Victorian forebearer, he was suddenly interrupted during one of his crimes, and as a result was robbed of his chance at carving out another trophy. Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini were so inseparable that they were nicknamed Vinaville by their friends, after an Italian brand of superglue. That moniker proved to be entirely prophetic, as they spent their final moments on this earth together, executed by shots from that same .22 while cuddling up in their car. But because the couple were parked up on a relatively busy stretch of road, the killer was interrupted by a good Samaritan who stopped to see if the vehicle's owner needed some help. This prompted the killer to immediately flee the scene. Despite paramedics finding Paolo Mainardi alive at the scene, he sadly passed away while receiving treatment at a Florence hospital. The morning after the murder, an anonymous person phoned Susanna Campi's mother and asked her to talk to her about her daughter. Obviously, the slaying of another couple was a harrowing and heartbreaking affair, but the mistake showed that the killer was getting sloppy, growing impatient. It seemed like only a matter of time before he made a mistake that would be his last. The Monster of Florence would go on to murder 2 vacationing German artists, Wilhelm Friedrich Horst Meyer and Jens Uwe Rusch, as well as a young couple, Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Gilda Rottini. Rottini had been followed by a strange man hours before she was killed. When investigators arrived, they found her pelvic region, as well as her left breast, had been removed. The killer's final victims would prove to be a couple out camping in the woods, Jean-Michel Cravicilli and Nadine Moriot. Their bodies took so long to find that the killer sent a taunting note, along with a piece of his victim's flesh, to the state prosecutor, Silvia della Monica, stating that a murder had taken place and challenging local authorities to find their bodies. But it seems this cry for attention was a bridge too far for the killer, who realized he was playing a dangerous game with the police and the media. The killing of the camping couple in September of 1985 would prove to be his final act of bloodshed, and for almost a decade, the case of the Monster of Florence remained cold. With the advent of more advanced computer technology, as well as hundreds of tips from the general public, a man named Pietro Pacciani was put on trial for the murders in 1994. Pacciani had previously been convicted of both the carnal assault and murder of his 2 daughters, as well as for the 1951 murder of a man who had been cavorting with a former lover. After searching his home, police discovered an unfired .22 bullet in his back garden. It was the exact same variety used in the monster murders. Pacciani was found guilty following his trial, but was released from prison 2 years later, following an appeal which cited poor police work, as well as a lack of solid physical evidence. 2 more men, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, were eventually convicted of the murders, and although they remain in prison to this day, their sentences have been widely criticized, and it's commonly believed that both men have been scapegoated for an unsolved crime. Years later, in 2001, the chief prosecutor on the case claimed that the murders were the work of a satanic cult who were allegedly operating in the greater area of Tuscany during the 70s and 80s. According to him, the victims' body parts were being used in an unholy blood ritual. This prosecutor had apparently discovered a villa in the area where Pacciani had been employed. The very same villa was home to a large, pyramidal stone, one that according to him was highly indicative of high-level cult activity. However, many have dismissed these claims as frankly laughable and insist the stone has no significance whatsoever. We've previously touched on how the Monster of Florence might be more suited to the name of the Tuscan Ripper, but perhaps another nickname is better suited: the Zodiac Killer. There are those who purport that the Monster of Florence and California's unmasked Zodiac Killer are in fact the very same person. Okay, so I know I'm releasing this video at a bit of a strange time, so hear me out. Just a few days ago, a group of cold case investigators, known as the Case Breakers, announced that they had identified the Zodiac Killer based on several pieces of compelling physical and forensic evidence. The Zodiac, they claim, was a man named Gary Francis Post. And this had a lot of people convinced that the Zodiac had finally been unmasked, especially since one of the Zodiac ciphers was recently decrypted. However, both the FBI and officials in California have shot down this claim and said that Gary Francis Post isn't a suspect in the Zodiac case. According to local authorities in San Francisco, the Casebreakers' evidence is circumstantial at best, and the case officially remains unsolved. So, with that in mind, what's this alleged connection between the Zodiac and the Monster of Florence? Well, in 2018, a trio of Italian news publications introduced the public to a man named Joe Bevilacqua. Born in the state of New Jersey on December 20th of 1935, Bevilacqua spent 20 years in the US Army before moving to Florence in 1974. It was there that he gained work at the Florence American Cemetery, a fitting form of employment for someone who allegedly already dealt with so much death. The theory's main proponent, Francesco Amicone, claimed that Bevilacqua had made a partial confession to him in September of 1997. He then corroborated the details of this confession, and found that the Zodiac murders had ceased almost at the exact same time as the monsters began, and matched a proposed timeline of Bevilacqua leaving the US and emigrating to Italy. Bevilacqua was incensed by such an accusation, and publicly threatened to sue Francesco Amicone if he didn't retract the allegations. Yet, unbelievably, Amicone refused to back down, and seemed to challenge Bevilacqua on a number of supposed coincidences. The main being that Bevilacqua would have been an undercover CID agent assigned to an investigation in San Francisco at the time of the Zodiac murders in the late 60s and early 70s. Amicone also alleged that Bevilacqua would have had access to the case files of a double murder which occurred near Florence in 1968, where bullets and shell casings had been improperly stored. He went on to claim that Bevilacqua replaced the pieces of evidence with spent cartridges shot by the gun he would use in the monster's homicides, thus connecting his future crimes to those murders for which he already had an alibi. The accusations were so thoroughly well presented that Italian authorities actually approached Bevilacqua in late 2020, requesting he provide a DNA sample in order to clear his name. The results of any DNA tests haven't been revealed to the public, and that's if any test has taken place at all. But it seems a chillingly strong argument can be made to support the idea that the Zodiac murders lasted far longer and were more far-reaching than anyone could have anticipated. To this day, even though 2 men sit in prison, many believe the Monster of Florence has never been caught. It's entirely possible that the murders could simply be down to a sadistic Italian serial killer, one who quit while they were ahead, having no wider connection to other killers, let alone an underground network of devil worshippers. But, at the same time, we can't rule out the possibility that Il Mostro di Firenze and the Zodiac Killer were one and the same, and that a man was able to brutally murder and mutilate young couples across 2 different continents with complete and utter impunity. Scary to think about. When we're behind our screens, interacting with strangers online, it's easy to feel this sense of anonymity, like we can get away with saying whatever we want to whoever we want. That really isn't the case though, especially on sites like Reddit. In the past, there have been numerous instances of people making posts, safe in the belief that there won't be any consequences. Time and again, however, those people have been proven wrong. There have been people who have confessed to cheating on their partners, only for another user to check out their history, connect a few dots, and realise that it's actually John who's married to their sister. There have been people who have gotten into arguments with other users, said the most vulgar things, only for the other person to find out who they are and get them fired from their job. Even if you use a throwaway account, sometimes a group of Reddit detectives will come together to uncover your real identity. That is, if the post you made warrants such drastic action. Some users have even been tracked down and questioned by the authorities, or even jailed for admitting to their unlawful actions. Despite that, thousands of people continue to air their dirty laundry every day on the site. Of course, most of these confessions are nothing too serious. There are, however, exceptions to that. 5 years ago, on r/AskReddit, user Purple Gherkins asked this question. To those of you who have accidentally killed someone, what went wrong? Of the more than 10,000 replies, most of them were either not personal accounts, accidental motor collisions, or instances where the user was either defending themselves or otherwise justified in their actions. Interesting reads, sure, but nothing nefarious. But buried in amongst all the replies was one that was very different. One that eventually caught everyone's attention. A response left by user Archaeology. This still haunts me to this day. As kids, we had a hideout in this dirt cliff, cove kind of thing. This is the best approximation I can find on Google, only 3 times taller and probably 10 times as wide. There was a neighborhood kid who, in hindsight, was probably mentally handicapped in some way, but to us he was just the weird, creepy kid. This was the 80s and we weren't exactly raised PC. 3 of us were headed to our base and found Creepy Kid sitting at the top in our guard chair. We yelled at him to get out, and he said something like, "Make me," and started lobbing dirt clods and sticks down at us. We all ran around the side to make our way up. It gets pretty fuzzy here, but all I remember is he fell, I still remember the sound. When we got back down to check on him, he was in a very awkward position, with blood coming out of his mouth. We all just freaked out and ran home, and as far as I know, no one has spoken a word of this to anyone. We didn't go back for over a month, and never said a word of it between us. Again, this was the 80s, so media wasn't like today. Chances are it got a small article in the newspaper B section. Missing mentally disabled child found dead after fall, or something like that. Some users sympathized with Barkeology's story, while others started questioning whether the other kid fell accidentally, or if he was pushed. Again, Barkeology said that his memory was fuzzy, but given the title of the thread, many speculated that it was the latter. But through his main comment, and various others that he left, Barkeology had given several key tidbits of identifying information, and behind the scenes, other editors were doing some sleuthing. One of them seemingly worked out who the victim was. Was it Scott Kleeshold? He went missing in 1988 in St. Charles, MO, correct? That would make you around 10 or 11 at the time he went missing. He would have been 9. Scott was last seen not far from his home, in the 3300 block of Lavernus Drive, walking near a wooded area known as the Trails. It was just before a fierce thunderstorm swept through the area. As long as 6 weeks after his disappearance, police conducted large-scale searches of the area near Scott's home. The searches involved digging at a labyrinth of caves in the wooded hillside where Scott was known to play with other neighborhood children. I don't know if it is this kid. If it were him, and if the story is what you said, it seems likely his body would have been found. A corpse of a 9-year-old at the bottom of some land formation can get washed away pretty easily in a storm, however. If it is or isn't him, you need to talk to your local PD. This discovery may have hit a nerve, because it was at that point that Barkeology deleted his original confession post. His account has since remained inactive for the past 5 years, and he offered up no further information about the incident. As it stands, it's unclear what happened to Barkeology, whether there was more to his story, or if he ever brought the matter up with the authorities. It's also unknown whether Scott Kleeshold was really the victim in question. But this post, and thousands like it, prove that you never know what skeletons someone might be hiding in their closet. Heck, maybe you have a few skeletons of your own. If you do, take my advice. Don't go posting about them on Reddit, or you might just end up in a video like this. So this next entry actually comes from a Facebook post. A post about a YouTube ad. One that, supposedly, watches you back. There's no footage to go along with it, just this screenshot, but the text itself paints a very clear and very unsettling picture. So back in 2019, a Facebook user named Raul Navarrete created a post that got shared around and gained a lot of attention. It revolves around an anuncio inteligente, or smart ad. Now I don't speak Spanish, but 2 very helpful people in my Discord server do, so big thanks to Isabeau and Lavender for translating this into English. Here's Raul's story. Something super weird just happened. I was watching YouTube on my smart TV, when, all of a sudden, an ad showed up, as is common on YouTube. I was gonna skip, when I noticed this ad was more than 5 hours long. It surprised me, and I called my dad so he could see the length of the video. I took a picture while I waited for my dad to get there. The girl in the ad kept talking, and by the time my dad got there, she directed her eyes at him. Even my dad joked that she was looking at him. My dad and I stood in front of the TV. The girl went quiet, and we felt like she was looking at the both of us. We kept thinking that that was impossible, that she couldn't look at us, since this wasn't a video call. It was an ad on YouTube. It was simply impossible for her to see us. We laughed at how dumb it sounded, and the girl kept speaking. But all of a sudden, she got close to the screen, and we started to feel a little uncomfortable and scared. My dad wanted to test if she was looking at us, so he said "Chunga" a couple of times. Then something incredible happened. The Asian girl said "Chunga" back. In that moment, we got scared, and I looked for the remote to skip the ad. Between my dad and I, we decided we were really tired. It had been a long day, But either way, we couldn't ignore this fact, and we turned off the TV. My doubts are, what the hell happened? Do TVs have cameras? If this is true, then I can see surveillance being possible. And finally, has YouTube been hacked? This thing that happened to my dad and I scared us. If something similar has happened to you, I'd like to know your story. This was mine. So obviously, there isn't any video proof to help legitimize this story, and all we have to go off is Raoul's word that this is true. In fairness, I have seen some crazy ads play on YouTube. Some have legit been over 2 hours, and I have seen ones that are really unsettling too. A lot of them aren't even trying to sell you anything, so it's pretty obvious to me that YouTube doesn't have the strictest requirements when it comes to advertising on their platform. That being said, unless there was hacking involved or YouTube was testing some sort of new ad function, I think the girl looking at them was just a pure coincidence. That, or more likely, Raoul just made the whole thing up. I'm almost 100% sure it's not possible to even livestream a commercial, let alone make an ad that's an actual video chat. So as interesting and haunting as this story's concept is, I think it's just that. A story. A good one though. Described as a pillar of his community, Joseph Martinez was an amateur astronomer and YouTuber known to his followers as Jupiter Joe. Old JJ had made headlines in local papers for his work with young astronomy enthusiasts in the Bronx, helping them see constellations and planets through all of New York's light pollution using his high-quality telescope. But until just this week, our friend Jupiter Joe had been harboring a dark secret. One he had been keeping for the past 22 years. One that will make you see him in a very different light. One that'll make you sick to your stomach. On February 24th, 1999, Minnie Soriano was on her way home from her middle school in the Bronx. Unfortunately, she never made it back to her apartment. Halfway through her journey, she was snatched by a then 27-year-old Jupiter Joe, who proceeded to do unspeakable things to her before strangling her and hiding her body in a dumpster. Minnie's remains wouldn't be found for another 4 days. She was just 13. For 22 years, investigators were left scratching their heads. All they had to work with was a small sample of their unknown killer's DNA left behind on Minnie's sweater. Every time they ran this sample through their system, it came back with 0 matches. This was likely the first and only time their man had struck, meaning his DNA profile wasn't on record. For a time, the police believed that the person responsible was either Minnie's stepfather or a handyman that worked at their apartment building, but both of them had solid alibis. Anyone with even a remote connection to Minnie or her family were questioned, then questioned again. There was nothing to link any of them to her demise. Minnie herself had a sweet and caring disposition, and was known as the Cinderella of her apartment block. Nobody held a grudge against her or her family. Needless to say, with no suspects and very little evidence to work with, the case quickly went cold. Now, it used to be that if you randomly killed a complete stranger, there'd basically be no way to link you to the crime, provided you didn't have any DNA evidence on file. Well, I'm happy to say that's changing. New advances in forensic science have made it possible to track down perps who don't have any DNA on record. And that's exactly how Jupiter Joe's past misdeed came to light. Using new and advanced familial DNA matching technology, forensic experts were able to map their elusive killer's family tree. This technique doesn't require there to be a 100% identical profile on record, but instead identifies partial matches, thus linking the suspect to family members already in the DNA database. Their search came back with a strong match, a male whose DNA was so similar to the perps that they must have been their biological father. From there, they just had to find that man's son, Joseph Martinez, aka Jupiter Joe. As it turns out, Joe had lived in the same apartment building as Minnie and her family back in 1999. Despite having been questioned back when the case was still fresh, he was never considered a suspect. Now, with all eyes on him, officers took a sample of his DNA. It matched perfectly with the sample found at the scene back in '99. on November 30th of this year, Joe was taken into custody. A historic arrest, considering it marks the first time the NYPD has used partial DNA matching to identify a perp. Though a now 49-year-old Joe has yet to stand trial, with so much evidence against him, it's safe to say this case has finally been solved. For 22 years, he believed he had gotten away with murder. Well, I'm glad to say, justice finally caught up with him. This is 21-year-old University of Virginia student Otto Warmbier. In early 2016, Otto was scheduled to visit Hong Kong as a part of a UVA study abroad program, but Otto had his heart set on visiting a very different Asian country whilst en route. He contacted Young Pioneer Tours, a Chinese-based adventure tour company, who promised destinations your mother would rather you stayed away from. Such places included the irradiated ruins of Pripyat, the wild, rocky frontiers of Afghanistan, and also Otto's desired travel destination, the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea. Otto arrived in North Korea's capital, Pyongyang, on the 29th of December 2015. His tour group included 10 other American citizens, as well as a Liverpudlian named Danny Grattan. Danny remembers that the tour group were a like-minded band of mostly young people, and despite the risky location, there was an overwhelming atmosphere of fun and excitement. Naturally, all tour groups that enter Pyongyang are strictly controlled by the North Korean government, but during the New Year tours, the Kim regime tries to show its guests that it parties just as heartily as the next country, and plies the tourists with vast amounts of booze. Danny Grattan remembers the group drank very heavily in Pyongyang's one and only hotel for foreign guests. However, there is one floor of the Yanggakdo International Hotel that is forbidden to foreigners. The so-called secret 5th floor that houses the hotel's staff. The 5th floor is devoid of any kind of luxury, with bare floors and grey-painted walls. The only colour comes from propaganda posters that line the walls. Foreign knowledge of the floor's existence has given rise to a kind of 5th floor challenge, daring tourists to venture into the forbidden hallways, sometimes just to peek, sometimes to take a few pictures. Those who are caught usually just receive a warning or have their cell phones seized. But at exactly 1:57 AM on New Year's Day, a man, purported to be Otto Warmbier, was caught on camera entering the forbidden floor. This figure supposedly tried to steal one of the propaganda posters, then left empty-handed. Just over 24 hours later, Otto and the rest of the tour group were sitting in the departure lounge of Pyongyang Airport, awaiting their flight back to Beijing. Danny Grattan remembers swapping contact details with Otto, only to see a gang of North Korean officials approaching with a look of urgency about them. "Otto Frederick Warmbier," one of them said. "Please, come with us." "Well, that's the last time we'll ever see you again," Danny half-joked. But Otto didn't look scared at all. In fact, he gave a kind of half-smile as he was led away. The group briefly awaited his return, but when their plane was ordered to take off without him, they began to fear the worst. Although North Korea admitted to detaining Otto, it took them 6 weeks to announce their reasons for doing so, that reason being subversion. According to the group that Otto was with, he wasn't even in the hotel that night, and the person in the CCTV footage didn't even resemble him. Still, the North Koreans went ahead with the trial. The picture you're looking at is of Otto's first public appearance since his arrest, one in which he begged Kim Jong-un's forgiveness. It was a complete show trial. Otto gave a coached confession, admitting to trying to take the poster, pretty much just reading from a script. If he played along, he was told, he'd be let go with a warning. At this point though, it does appear that he broke character, genuinely pleading for his life. It was widely believed that the US State Department would secure Otto's release before sentencing. However, the North Koreans shocked the world by condemning him to 15 years hard labour. The US continued to demand Otto's release, and after a while, the North Koreans eventually gave in when things started getting heated. However, when Otto was delivered back to America, he was severely brain damaged and in a vegetative state. Everyone was horrified. the North Koreans claimed that Otto had fallen into a coma after contracting botulism shortly after his trial, possibly as a result of eating rotten food. This is doubtful. As one doctor put it, for somebody who had supposedly been bedridden for more than a year, his body was in excellent condition. In Otto's case, there are definitely things the North Koreans aren't telling us. Having lost all hope, Cynthia and Fred Warmbier requested that Otto's feeding tube be removed. He passed away on the 19th of June, 2017. His story constitutes a terrifying cautionary tale that speaks to the mercilessness and brutality of the Kim regime. Looking at this photo of Otto begging for mercy, knowing he wasn't going to get any, it's truly haunting stuff. "25-year-old Li Xiehua, better known online as Kcriss Li, is, or perhaps was, a Chinese journalist and content creator with almost 70,000 YouTube subscribers. Prior to making his videos, he worked for CCTV, China's biggest state-run news channel. Now, if you know anything about China, it's that freedom of expression isn't high on their to-do list, and those who either criticize the government or otherwise make it look bad are often silenced. When Kcriss became disillusioned by the amount of censorship going on at CCTV, he of course decided to quit, and instead began filming his own informative videos, this time documenting the truth and giving his own honest opinions. If you head over to Kriss's channel, you'll see that he only has 7 videos. The first 4 deal with, let's call it the current global situation, the Big C. They were all uploaded between the 12th and 25th of February 2020, so just when the severity of the situation was dawning on us all. He filmed these videos at the epicenter of this whole thing, Ground Zero, Wuhan. You all know where. Kcriss had heard through the grapevine that a prominent lawyer named Chen Qiushi had started vlogging about conditions in the city. While reporting there, Chen had mysteriously disappeared, and to this day hasn't been seen or heard from again. Believing there was some type of cover-up going on, and that Chen had been permanently silenced by the state, Kcriss travelled into the Red Zone to uncover the truth. With the help of some locals, he was able to find an apartment in the city and got himself a vehicle. From there, he began vlogging. 我会尽我的所能，通过我的视角，带给你们我在这里的所见所闻。我是李泽华 Kcriss，我们下个视频见。Kcriss took his camera to the streets, conducting interviews, visiting hospitals, and exposing the failures of his government to the entire world, and showing how they were intentionally concealing what was going on there. But he was saying too much, showing too much, and it wasn't long before the strong hand of the government came knocking. You don't have to be able to read Mandarin to get the meaning behind Kriss's first and only YouTube short. This live video, entitled SOS, is only 30 seconds long, and shows a clearly terrified Kcriss as he travels down a motorway. He states that moments prior, a white SUV was driving directly at him down the wrong side of the road. Apparently, it suddenly swerved in front of his vehicle in an attempt to block his path, and the men inside told him to surrender. He instead hit the accelerator, and the SUV was now following him. Friends, I'm on the road right now, being pursued and chased by state authorities who are in an unmarked van. The only thing I can do right now is make this video. I'm in Wuhan. I'm driving very fast, and they're chasing me. Pray for me. Soon after uploading this, Kcriss made it back to his apartment and immediately began live streaming. The stream lasted for nearly 4 hours. The majority of that time, the screen remained black as Kcriss sat in the dark, lights off, not making a sound, hoping the men chasing him would think he wasn't home. At various points, you can hear them outside, knocking on his door. After hiding in the dark for over 3 hours, a distressed Kcriss turns on the lights and addresses his viewers. I predicted this would most likely happen, but I never knew they'd find me so quick. I'm not going to try and escape, because there's no use now. I just think it's funny. Before coming to Wuhan, after I resigned from CCTV, I had a long talk with my producer. It feels so unreal. Before, when I turned on the camera to talk, it was for others. Today, I can finally speak my own thoughts, but these own thoughts will probably become my final speech. At the very end of the stream, as Chris's internet connection gets weaker and more patchy, he begins talking to the men outside his apartment, explaining why it's important for a journalist to report the truth and appealing to their decency. He then opens the door. 2 men enter the apartment, and the video ends abruptly. For 2 months after that, Kcriss was missing. He didn't make any more videos, and his viewers feared the worst. Then, on April 22nd, 2020, after 2 months of silence, Kcriss suddenly uploaded a 6-minute video, titled, "I'm Kcriss. Here is something about me since February 26th. February 26th was the day he disappeared. This video seemed completely out of character. The style of the video was totally different from all of his other uploads, as was his neutral tone. And despite being critical of the CCP in the past, now he was singing their praises and denouncing himself. He said that he was fine, and that he had been treated very well. The whole thing seemed oddly scripted, like Kcriss was being forced by the state to make this video against his will. He just stands in the center of the screen, in some blank, featureless room, robotically delivering his message. Kcriss even ended the video with a strange quote from the Book of Documents.
愿天佑华夏，愿世界人民团结。这些日子，无数纷乱的思绪满溢于我的脑海，有的转瞬即逝，有的只可缄默，唯独这一句不堪之论，铸印于心，不可磨灭。人心为微，道心为微，为精为一，允直绝中。
The setting, the delivery, everything about this video makes you wonder who's standing just off screen. Since that final video, Kcriss hasn't uploaded any new content, and hasn't made any posts on his social media accounts either. He's simply vanished from the internet. With China's dodgy human rights track record, many have become concerned for Kriss's safety and well-being, myself included. Many suspect he's been placed in a re-education camp. Others fear something even worse might have happened to him. But what Kcriss did was incredibly important. He exposed the truth about the global situation at a time when true reports out of China were hard to come by. He was brave enough to speak out, and I fear he may have paid dearly for that. If you're looking for some weird videos that give off strong Uncanny Valley vibes, there's a channel on YouTube called Florescita Dreams. Let's take a scroll down their homepage, and... oh... okay, some of these thumbnails are a bit strange. Yeah, this channel's a bit of a trip, and that's even before watching one of their videos. If you decide to go that far, then things only get more bizarre.
Soy la Chavesa y ya me contó mi marido lo estupidísimo de ti, niñato del metro de Valencia, que andas molestando a los ancianos y al ver a mi topa.
All of their uploads are very cryptic. It doesn't help that they're all in Spanish either. Still, I don't think you need to be bilingual to appreciate just how weird this content is. Strange images, unsettling sounds, a million questions. But as much as I, and I'm sure you, can appreciate the creepiness of all of these weird images and sounds, there's actually more going on under the surface in these videos. Well, in one of the videos at least. Their most popular. A video titled Kinetica del Patron, Selene Delgado. I don't recommend you watch this video late at night by yourself. There are some really disturbing images in it that I'm not going to show here, but they're certainly not for the faint of heart, so stay away if you're not into that. But without a knowledge of Spanish or an understanding of the context, it would be easy to write this whole video off as some sort of creepy art project, designed to leave a bad taste in your mouth. Though there's definitely some intentional shock value here, this video actually puts forward an interesting hypothesis. First, some backstory. Televisa is a Mexican multimedia company that effectively has a monopoly on the nation's TV industry. Back in the 90s and into the 2000s, they played this segment on Channel 5 called Servicio a la Comunidad, a community service broadcast that would play in between shows throughout the day. The whole thing was designed to help find people that had disappeared, very similar to an Amber Alert. During each segment, the names and faces of missing people would be displayed one by one, and the announcer would tell you their last known location. The show is still remembered and talked about to this day, mostly by those who grew up watching it when they were young. In fact, the broadcasts were targeted at a younger audience. It played during the commercial breaks of cartoons and other family-friendly shows, and given the bleak and somber nature of the announcements, it scared a lot of young viewers. One minute, they'd be immersed in their favourite show, not a care in the world. Then, they'd be interrupted by this.
XHGC Canal 5, al servicio de la comunidad. Pedimos ayuda para localizar a Víctor Gama Tavera, de 20 años de edad. Se ignora su paradero desde el 28 de mayo del año 2000. Esteban Mendoza Juárez, de 24 años, se ignora su paradero desde el 29 de abril. Va en compañía del menor Víctor Daniel Mendoza Rodríguez. Cristian Vélez Zamudio va en compañía de los menores Erika Cecilia y Cristian Daniel Vélez Ávila. Cualquier informe a los teléfonos de Canal 5.
As one YouTube user noted in the comment section of this broadcast, there you were, sitting on the couch, sipping a glass of choco milk at 8 or 9 AM, when the shrill sounds of cartoons and ads for toys and junk food were suddenly interrupted by an agonizing, ominous silence. The voice of the announcer, forever recorded in your memories, describing unknown persons, giving you dates, and describing disappearances. Can people really get lost for so long? All of the while, that ominous silence, gloomy and empty, made your blood run cold as a wave of questions and fears possessed your mind. What if that happened to me, or to my mum, or my dad, or some other member of my family? No, that couldn't happen to me. Right? So that was the whole premise of the segment. Missing people, appeals for information, and if you went missing in Mexico, there was a decent-sized chance that your face would pop up in one of these broadcasts. The most famous face to air during Servicio a la Comunidad was undoubtedly Selene Delgado Lopez. During its long television run, Selene featured in almost every iteration of Servicio a la Comunidad. The weird thing was, only this one photo of her was ever used. A low-quality, grainy image set against a white background. Little information was ever told about her, other than the fact that she was 18 and disappeared in Mexico City. From the beginning, a lot of viewers agreed that there was something off about this photo. Not everyone could quite articulate what it was exactly, but there was something unsettling about Selene, and the fact that her face popped up every so often meant that it stuck with them. This later sparked several rumors about her, including the theory explored in Florecita Dream's video, that Selene Delgado wasn't a real person. The grainy picture, combined with her relatively generic facial features, led many to speculate that Selene's photo was computer-generated. As these rumors started gaining traction, people began digging deeper. Strangely, no public record of any missing person named Selene Delgado Lopez could be found. After that got out, this theory became a full-blown Mexican urban legend, and as the internet became more widespread, so too did the theory that Selene Delgado never existed. To help spread the legend further, people started posting hoax videos online like this. This image was made around the same time Selene reportedly disappeared. It's actually a composite of Derek Todd Lee, the Baton Rouge Slayer, but has since become associated with Selene. Due to the facial proportions of this composite being very similar to that of Selene's face, some have suggested that this was one of the templates used to digitally generate Selene's photo. Florecita Dreams makes the same claim. They supposedly proved this by using a 3D modeling program, demonstrating that Selene's face was made from an amalgamation of other images, both real people and other composites. According to them, Selene's face is too similar to these images to be real, and that her photo was constructed using features from various faces. If that's true, then that means the Channel 5 broadcasters intentionally chose to include this fake person in their segment. Selene's picture certainly left a lasting impression on everyone who saw it, so it's possible it was included as a sort of warning to all of their young viewers. Stay vigilant and safe. Personally, I'm not sure this theory holds up. I mean, sure, Selene's face is pretty generic, but by definition, so are most people's. And yeah, the camera is pretty terrible. But this was the 90s, and poorer Mexican families at the time wouldn't have had access to high-quality cameras. There was no public record of Selene going missing, sure, but since 1964, a staggering 214,000 people have disappeared in Mexico. It's possible her records were either lost, misplaced, or not even filed in the first place. The authorities may have simply had too much else going on to bother with her. Not to mention, with so many missing people in Mexico, it's not like Channel 5 had to resort to making up stories and lying to drum up attention for their channel. Oh dear. So as it turns out, Channel 5's Twitter page caused quite a stir last year, when, for a while, they began posting extremely creepy videos at around 3 AM every night, only to delete them a few hours later. So that's some really strange content for a professional company's Twitter page to be posting. But what really caught everyone's attention was when they posted this, captioned, Selene, obviously a reference to Selene Delgado. Now clearly this was all a marketing tactic, with the creepy videos all being distorted versions of other clips found online, some more famous than others. Channel 5 themselves are clearly aware of the Selene mystery, and used her name to get on Twitter's trending page. But what this goes to show is that Channel 5 aren't exactly above this type of ploy, making it more plausible that they faked the image of Selene back in the 90s, just like Florecita Dreams asserts. Whatever the truth behind the Selene Delgado mystery, her story's been very well known in Spanish-speaking internet communities for a long time. However, a fairly recent development brought the urban legend to the attention of the rest of the world. So if you go onto Facebook right now and search the name Selene Delgado Lopez, this account pops up. The woman in this photo sort of resembles an aged-up version of the original, grainy photo of Selene. Intrigued users clicked on her profile, curious if this might be the real Selene. Was she real after all? And if so, was she alive? To their horror, everyone who clicked on their profile realized they were already friends with her, despite never having added her in the first place. More bizarrely, there was no option to unfriend her. People started claiming that she was friends with everyone on Facebook, and began saying that the profile was haunted or otherwise nefarious. The account's profile picture ended up being shared more than 126,000 times by spooked users, showing just how far this rumor spread. In reality, this was obviously all bull. This Selene Delgado was simply an ordinary woman who happened to share the same name as our subject. This Selene had simply changed her Facebook privacy settings, hiding the Add Friend button. She wasn't everyone's friend on Facebook after all. It's actually impossible to have more than 5,000 friends on the site. After being bombarded with messages, this poor woman had to reply to some, saying, "I am not missing, nor have I ever been. I'm at home with my family and fine." To be honest, I'm not even sure how this offshoot of the Delgado mystery became so popular. I guess one day, someone just saw that there was no Add Friend button, checked the woman's name, and linked it to the popular Mexican legend. Then, boom, hysteria spread. Seriously, do people not know you can change your settings on Facebook? Since then, there have been no new developments, and the truth about the original Delgado broadcast remains shrouded in mystery. Was she a real person, who sadly vanished without a trace, never to be seen again? her family left without closure, and her memory reduced to a slew of fake urban legends? Or did she never exist in the first place? Her face a mixture of several others combined, designed to either scare youngsters into keeping their guards up, or to get people talking about Channel 5. I doubt we'll ever have any definitive proof one way or the other, to be honest. I mean, personally, I suspect the former, but hope for the latter. The only thing I do know is that, this image, that's gonna stay in there for a while. Good night. In January of 1983, a group of young boys were playing in a wooded area on Hoap Mountain near Seoul, South Korea. Little did they know, they were about to make a grisly discovery. One of the youngsters pointed out a mannequin lying in a pile of leaves in the distance. An odd thing to be in the middle of the woods. As they drew closer, they realized it wasn't a mannequin at all. It was the corpse of a young woman, frozen stiff with rigor mortis. Whoever she was, the anguished expression on her face suggested that she had died in great pain. Morticians estimated that she'd been dead for at least a month when the boys found her. Her fingerprints identified her as 24-year-old Kyung-hee Kim, a barbershop worker from the city. In parts of Asia, there are certain barbershops that offer more than just haircuts, and provide other services to their male clientele, let's put it like that. Well, it was at one such barbershop that Miss Kim worked at. She needed the money, you see. With no external injuries to speak of, it was determined that Miss Kim had died from poisoning. It seemed unlikely that she would climb up Mount Hoap in the middle of winter just to take her own life, and given the nature of her work and the type of customers it attracted, police began their investigation at the barbershop. One of Kim's most loyal customers was a 42-year-old man named Dong Sik Lee, a plumber by trade. Lee's true passion, however, was photography. He'd won numerous awards for his work, something he couldn't help but bring up in conversation, and he often held private photo exhibitions for other enthusiasts. Detectives surprised Mr. Lee by knocking on his door one evening and asking him about the death of Miss Kim. Mr. Lee said that he didn't know anything about it, that he only enjoyed making use of Kim's professional services and nothing more. Naturally though, he couldn't help but bring up the fact that he was an award-winning amateur photographer. That admission proved to be his downfall. The investigators asked if they could see some of his pictures. Lee said he didn't have much time, but the investigators insisted. Lee capitulated and led them into the room where he kept his photos. Among all of these hundreds of photos were images of scantily clad women posing as murder victims. The investigators questioned Lee about them, to which he replied, "I have an affection for cadavers." Well, the photos were obviously staged. These weren't pictures of real dead women. Lee's second wife was also in one of the photos, pretending to be dead, and in reality, she was alive and well. Clearly Lee was just a weird guy who viewed death as art and was playing out his bizarre fantasy with paid models. But just as they were finishing up, one of the investigators noticed Lee stealthily trying to pocket one of the photos. He grabbed it from Lee's hand before sharing it with his colleagues. One by one, the detectives examined it and looked up at each other with knowing expressions. There was no mistaking it. It showed what appeared to be a dead Miss Kim, lying on a pile of leaves, wearing the same clothes she had been found in. They immediately searched Lee's basement and found 20 even more disturbing photos. They were all of Miss Kim, and they were time-sequenced, showing her writhing on the ground, clutching at her chest and gasping for air. They'd been taken as she lay, dying. Lee was immediately taken into custody. Of course, he maintained that he hadn't taken Miss Kim's life, and that she was just another model, posing for the camera. He admitted that he had gone up to Hoap Mountain with Miss Kim, but that it was just for a photo shoot. He said he left the mountain without her, and that someone else must have come along after that and taken her life. Very coincidental. Well, it was obvious to everyone that playing pretend wasn't doing it for Mr. Lee anymore. He had taken things a step further and decided to live out his dark, twisted fantasy. When forensic specialists zoomed in on the photos of Miss Kim, they noticed that the hair on her skin was gradually drooping more and more in each consecutive picture, something that happens as a person perishes. That proved that she wasn't just acting. As it turns out, Li had manipulated Miss Kim during one of his regular sessions at the barbershop. He had gone there many times over the course of 3 weeks and charmed her with stories about the award-winning photos he had taken, the amazing exhibitions he had put on, and the models he had made famous. "Oh, by the way, Miss Kim, you'd make a great subject yourself. I bet I could make you famous too," he had told her. After regular visits, he had gained Miss Kim's trust. So, when he invited her to a private photo shoot up on Mount Hoop, she of course said yes. This could be her big break, her chance to finally live a decent life. On December 14th, 1982, the pair walked to that secluded area of the woods for Miss Kim's first and last portrait session. As Li set up his camera, he remarked how chilly it was that day and offered Kim a tablet, which he said was cold medicine. "It'll prevent you from getting sick," he told her. "Trust me." Well, she did, and gulped down one of the pills. But it wasn't cold medicine at all. The capsule actually contained potassium cyanide. It wasn't long before her insides began aching, then burning. As she fell down into the leaves, Li was ready and waiting with his camera. As she begged for help, all Li did was take her picture, again and again. The last thing she likely saw was the camera's flash before everything went black. 4 years later, Mr. Li's own world faded to black too, when he was executed on May 27th, 1986. Before his sentence was carried out, Li stated, "The way a human being dies, it's art. I only took artistic photographs." This is the reconstructed face of Bitter Creek Betty, also known as Rose Doe, due to the distinctive rose tattoo on her chest. On March 1st, 1992, a truck driver in Sweetwater, Wyoming, came across what he thought were 2 trash bags at the bottom of an embankment on the side of the road. As he examined them from a distance, he realized what he was actually looking at. The body of a woman, face down in the snow, completely clothless. He quickly radioed in his discovery. Although she'd been dead for between 1 and 5 months before being found, all the snow meant that Bitter Creek Betty had stayed well preserved. In fact, she was so thoroughly frozen that it took a full 24 hours for her remains to thaw out, after which the coroners made some gruesome discoveries. They determined that the unknown woman had likely been killed with an ice pick which had been thrust up into her left nostril. Other signs of physical trauma were also present around her neck and face. Given that Betty was found in Bitter Creek, an area just off the I-80, America's busiest east-to-west highway, investigators theorized that her body had hastily been tossed from a transport truck. Betty's fingerprints were scanned, but no matches were found. As such, this composite was created to show what Betty may have looked like when she was alive. A post-mortem photo with drawn-on eyes was also released, but it's quite eerie to look at, so I won't show that here. Regardless, believe me when I say that this is one instance where the police sketch is actually very accurate. After examining her DNA, forensics showed that Bitter Creek Betty was of South American and European descent. She was 5'8", weighed around 125 to 130 pounds, and was between 24 and 32 years old. Though she had no clothes on when she was found, she was wearing some jewellery, notably a gold necklace and a gold wedding ring on her left ring finger. That strongly suggests that our doe had a husband, making it stranger that nobody had come forward to claim her remains, or even report her missing. A cesarean scar on her abdomen indicated that she had also given birth at least once in her lifetime. As previously stated, she had a distinctive rose tattoo with Chinese lettering on the stem. This tattoo was traced to a business in Tucson, Arizona. The artist underwent hypnosis to help the detectives with their investigation. Through this method, he was able to remember that Ardot had come into the store in June 1991, that she was a Hispanic hitchhiker who spoke without an accent, and that she'd been wearing a brown dress detailed with the yellow flowers. That dress was depicted in her sketch. After Bitter Creek Betty's remains were examined, her case was linked to another unidentified murder victim, Utah's Sheridan County Jane Doe. DNA found at both scenes suggested that a serial killer with blood type O was responsible for their slayings. That development later proved hugely significant. 28 years after Betty's body was found, in May of 2020, a long-haul truck driver named Clark Perry Baldwin was arrested not only for her slaying, but also for taking the lives of Sheridan County Jane Doe and a Tennessee woman named Pamela McCall. Pamela was pregnant at the time she was slain, and as such, the 59-year-old was charged with 4 counts of first degree. His trial is still ongoing. It's likely that Baldwin took the lives of many other women during his active years, and a few other Jane Doe cases similar to Bitter Creek Betty's are now being reinvestigated. Among them, North Carolina's New Hope Jane Doe, who was also found dumped 15 feet down an embankment along the I-40. Her shoes have been taken as some sort of sick souvenir. Though it seems likely the perp in Bitter Creek Betty's story has been found and will face justice, her identity still remains a mystery. Thus far, 9 people have been ruled out as possibilities. It's strange to think that somewhere out there, this woman had a husband and a child, but her body still remains unclaimed. Sure, they may have become estranged prior to her demise. Maybe they even passed away before that point too, but it just seems like somebody out there must know who she was. Why haven't they come forward? Why was she never reported missing? On the bright side, of all the cases I've covered and will cover in this video, Betty's is by far the most likely to be solved. More than a quarter of a century has passed since Windy Point Jane Doe's body was found in Colorado, and all these years later, her true name still remains unknown. Back in 1994, her skeletal remains were found scattered above Divine Road near Windy Point Campground. For all anyone knows, they could have been left there years prior, with nobody ever coming across them. In her case, foul play was instantly suspected. Forensic scientists did their best to create this image of what Jane Doe may have looked like in life. Yeah, unfortunately the technology wasn't quite there at the time. I'm getting some strong Uncanny Valley vibes off this one. For years, this was the best that detectives had to work with, and although the reconstruction actually generated a few calls, none of them led anywhere. Without the woman's identity, or anything else to work with, there was little the investigators could do. Well, that was a long time ago, and technology has improved leaps and bounds since then. Nowadays, EFITs can be generated using familial DNA collected from genealogy sites like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA. By analysing the DNA of people distantly related to John and Jane Doe's, far more accurate composites can be created to show us what the victims may have looked like in life. In May of 2019, such an EFIT was created for Windy Point Jane Doe, using only the DNA collected from her bones. As you can see, the updated EFIT is quite different from the original. With these new advancements, forensic experts were also able to conclude that she was between 35 and 45 years old when she died, that she was 5 foot 4 inches tall, and that she was Caucasian with auburn-coloured hair. Though this new image is yet to help authorities uncover Windy Point's true identity, I've included this one to show just how much better these reconstructions are getting, how technology is helping to give new life to the long dead, and how even when we can't give a Doe back their name, we can at least give them back a face. In northeast Hong Kong, there's a popular recreational area called Sai Kung. It's famous for its hiking spots, beaches, and for its inordinate number of disappearances and deaths. Sai Kung itself isn't particularly big, but the natural beauty of the peninsula has basically remained untouched, and it's full of long and winding trails, so it's easier to see how people might get lost there. That being said, there are signs and markers all along the hiking routes, and each signpost has its own unique set of coordinates written on it. If you were to get lost somewhere, or feel like you were too weak to continue your hike, all you'd have to do is call for help, state the coordinates on the nearest sign, and help would be on the way. That makes it all the weirder that so many people have vanished or perished while exploring Sai Kung, especially when you consider the mysterious circumstances surrounding each incident. In September of 2009, an off-duty police officer was out hiking alone in Sai Kung. He called the emergency services for help and told the operator that he was lost and needed to be rescued. Thankfully, he was right next to one of the marked signposts, so he read off its coordinates to the operator. Strangely, the coordinates he provided didn't match with any on record, meaning the operator had no idea where the officer actually was. The call then ended abruptly, and despite an extensive search and rescue effort, the lost officer was never seen or heard from again. To this day, his whereabouts, or more accurately, the whereabouts of his body, remain a mystery. This incident quickly captured the public's imagination, and a movie was even made about the officer's disappearance, called Missing. His mysterious vanishing didn't surprise some locals, however. It had long been believed that Sai Kung was an ominous place. According to Cantonese folklore, the peninsula was home to some sort of otherworldly portal or barrier, which one should never cross. Only 1 month after the officer went missing, a male and 4 females were out hiking in the same area. The male became tired and told the women to go ahead, said that he'd catch up. He never did. The women went back to look for him, but found no trace of their missing friend. 2 days later, his body showed up next to the trail where they had been searching. His cause of death remains unclear to this day. This man was a Boy Scout troop leader and knew his way around nature very well, adding to the bizarreness of his demise. Later that same year, a bus driver was out hiking alone in Sai Kung. When he didn't return home that day, his family tried calling his phone to check that he was okay. To their surprise, a fisherman answered it, saying that he had found the phone in a river. The bus driver was never found. In 2011, another man called the emergency services, saying that he was lost on a Sai Kung hiking trail. Just like the lost officer before him, his call suddenly disconnected, and he was never seen or heard from again. A number of other strange deaths have occurred on the Sai Kung Peninsula, dating all the way back to 2005, right up to more recent incidents in 2019 and even 2020. In each of these instances, a lone male's body was found, resting beside a trail. Foul play is suspected in at least one of these cases, but for the most part, there's been little evidence to suggest that there's a serial killer loose on Sai Kung, and the majority of these deaths have been attributed to accidental falls. But what about the people who have completely disappeared? The Sai Kung hiking trails are all clearly marked, well maintained, and aren't known to be treacherous routes. Most of the dead and missing were experienced hikers, and were knowledgeable about the area, and about navigation and basic survival skills. But here's the most interesting part. There is an account from a man named Chung who became lost in Sai Kung, but actually managed to make it out alive. According to Chung, he was out hiking in the area when he suddenly and inexplicably lost consciousness. He awoke at 8 PM and tried to get back to civilization, but in his own words said that, "When I tried to leave, it was weird. No matter how far I walked, I never got any closer to getting out." On his second day lost in the wilderness, he saw 2 people and shouted out to them. They didn't react to him, but they both disappeared right in front of his eyes. After resting for a while, he saw another figure come running right out of the tree line. He tried chasing after them, hoping they might help him. "I chased that man all the way down," said Chung. "He changed into people I knew and people I didn't know during that chase, but when I caught up, they all disappeared." Exhausted, Chung fell asleep. When he awoke on the 3rd day, he noticed that several items he had been carrying had disappeared. He also realized that his surroundings had changed, and that he wasn't where he had fallen asleep the previous night. He described the area as having the vibe of an old graveyard, and during that day, he apparently saw many people that all disappeared as he reached out to them. On the 4th day, he awoke to find his surroundings had changed yet again, and that the rocks around him were all making a strange, rumbling noise. He made his way down the trail in front of him, and all the while, the rocks continued to rumble. Eventually, he ran into a young guy from Thailand. Difference was, this guy didn't disappear. He was real, and he lent Chung his cell phone to call for help. After 4 days, Chung finally emerged from the Sai Kung Mountains. One strange thing that he and his rescuers noticed was that Chung hadn't been bitten by any mosquitoes or other bugs during his whole ordeal. This was June, and the mountains of Sai Kung were absolutely swarming with the little buggers, making his lack of bite marks extremely strange. A weird story to say the least, but what do you think? Did Chung and the less fortunate souls before him pass through the so-called Sai Kung Barrier and enter some other plane of existence, an alternate dimension? Or can his strange experiences be chalked up to dehydration and exhaustion? Is there some mysterious portal on the Hong Kong Peninsula, or are all of these deaths and disappearances simply the result of accidents? If so, whatever happened to the remains of the other experienced hikers who still haven't been found? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. It was September 26th, 2014, a warm day in Iguala, Mexico. At approximately 6 p.m, more than 100 students from an all-male teacher training school arrived in the city, all of them in their late teens and early 20s. They were on their way to the capital, but made a brief stop in Iguala to commandeer a couple of buses. You see, these students weren't traveling to Mexico City to do a relaxing spot of sightseeing. They were on their way there to protest against the Tlatelolco student massacre that took place in 1968. Students from their particular teacher training school were known for being politically active, and this commandeering of public buses was a time-honoured annual tradition. Each year, they'd take over 2 or 3 buses, drive north to Mexico City, and march against the injustices that had taken place in 1968 and in all the years since. Though quite annoying for anyone hoping to ride those particular buses that day, their behaviour was generally tolerated by both the public and the police. And since they were using the buses for a good cause, and always returned the vehicles after each year's march, even the bus companies tolerated their annual escapades. As such, the borrowing of the buses had always been a relatively smooth and peaceful affair. But 2014's protest was set to begin and end very differently. Just like in all the previous years, the students joined together and took control of several public buses. They began their drive from Iguala to Mexico City, their spirits high. Little did they know what was about to hit them. While en route to the capital, police officers and federal military forces intercepted the buses and tried to force them to pull over. According to the authorities, it was because the students had stolen the buses. Strange, considering that they had tolerated their behaviour in the past and were quite familiar with this annual event. Their actual motive for pulling the buses over has been the topic of much debate over the past 7 years, as have the events that happened next. According to the police, when they tried to stop the buses, the students accelerated and tried to escape. As such, the police gave chase and began to open fire on the buses to get them to stop, killing 2 students in the process. They also shot at another bus, which they mistook for one that the students had taken, but which actually carried a local football team. The bus driver, one of the players, and a woman in a nearby taxi were all killed as a result of that mistake. The surviving students apparently jumped out of their vehicles at that point and fled into the surrounding hills. The following morning, one of the students who had tried to run, Julio Cesar Mondragon, was found lying in the dirt. His eyes had been gouged out, and the skin on his face had been flayed to the bare bone. This discovery made it obvious that there was something more sinister than police incompetence at play. But here's where the mystery comes in. More than 100 students had gotten on those buses that fateful evening in 2014. 2 of them were gunned down by officers, and 1 of them was found mutilated the next day. That much we already know. But 43 of the survivors never returned, and were never seen or heard from again. After clashing with the law, they just vanished into thin air. For the past 7 years, the citizens of Mexico have referred to these students as the 43, and have questioned, debated, and constantly protested for answers about what actually happened to them. 43 young men don't just disappear after all. stories from the surviving students that actually did return from the hills contradicted the police's official report. They said that when the authorities pulled their buses over, they complied. When their buses had come to a stop, armed officers and soldiers immediately began opening fire on them. There was, of course, panic on board the buses at this point, with students dropping to the ground in order to avoid the bullets. That's why they had fled into the hills. Well, some of them at least. According to eyewitnesses, the police boarded the buses and rounded up the remaining students, those who had avoided the bullets but were too scared to run. They then forced them into police vehicles and drove off with them into the night. This convinced the public that the whole attack had been premeditated. Whatever had happened to the missing 43 students, nobody held out much hope that they were still alive, especially after bone fragments from 2 of them were discovered in a river. Some speculated that the mayor of Iguala City, Jose Luis Abarca, ordered the students to be captured for disrupting his wife's election campaign. He then handed them to a group of gangsters who killed them and burned their bodies in a local landfill. Their bone fragments were then tossed into the nearby river. This theory indeed seemed plausible, given that same mayor had previously been accused of murdering an activist who stood against him. So many people believed that the mayor and his wife were responsible that they started referring to this version of events as the historical truth, despite independent forensic teams stating that it was unlikely. But as of October 2021, we can throw the historical truth away and replace it with a real answer. As you might have gathered, the police were strongly involved, and ironically, it appears they were partners in crime with the Iguala cartel. Just a couple of months ago, transcripts of text messages between the deputy police chief of Iguala and a local crime boss were released to the public. Messages that proved the authorities had worked alongside the cartel to round up, torture, and kill the missing students. In a cruel twist of fate, the buses the students had commandeered that day just so happened to be part of an operation the cartel was running, and were secretly carrying a cargo of heroin. This cargo was about to be driven over the border into the US before the students inadvertently took control of the buses. To be clear, the students themselves had no idea what was actually hidden on the vehicles. It was just a case of taking the wrong bus at the wrong time. After the clash with the cops, Deputy Police Chief Francisco Salgado Valladares messaged Gildardo Lopez Astudillo, the local leader of the Guerreros Unidos cartel. Salgado told the crime lord that he had just rounded up some boys who had stolen his cargo. Reading through the texts, the fate of the students becomes disturbingly clear. Deputy Salgado told crime boss Lopez he had 21 students held on the bus and 17 more cornered in a cave. It's safe to assume that the latter group were among those who tried to run, but who weren't able to hide. Cartel leader Lopez replied by saying he wanted them all, and that he had beds to terrorize them in. They agreed to meet at a place called Wolf's Gap to exchange the students, and Deputy Salgado told Lopez to bring enough men to handle the job. What exactly happened to the students after that remains a mystery, since aside from a few bone fragments, none of their bodies have ever been found. But from Lopez's texts, it's clear that they didn't die quickly. They had inconvenienced the wrong gangster. The people of Mexico still have a lot of questions about that horrible night in 2014. How were the students tortured? Where are their remains? If 21 students were captured on the bus and 17 more caught in a cave, that only makes 38. What about the remaining 5? Since the real culprits behind the students' vanishing have only just been unmasked, we don't have all of the answers just yet. But we can now say with confidence that the young men are dead, that both the police and the Iguala cartel were behind their massacre, and that the previous Mexican government were trying to cover up what had happened. Although not specifically stated in the messages, it appears as if the military were also involved in what happened and helped to apprehend the students. The cartel's influence runs deep. If there's one other thing we can say with confidence, it's that this was a callous and unnecessary waste of human life. The massacre of so many young men. It's enough to make your blood boil. Deputy Salgado has already been incarcerated for his role in the slayings. crime boss Lopez, on the other hand, was taken into custody, but was released over a supposed failure of due process. He remains a free man as we speak. With a population of just under 2 million, the North Vietnamese province of Tay Binh is one of the country's most unique and well-known regions. With its name meaning Great Peace, Tay Binh is essentially a distinct, cultural island, separated from its neighbours by the Great Red River Delta. Yet, Tay Binh is also the home of the Tran family, who, in 2002, fell victim to a mysterious and terrifying phenomenon. The Trans were essentially your average rural Vietnamese family, with 4 different generations all living under one roof. The head of the family, 65-year-old Tran Van Rang, was the father of 8 children, 2 of which had young families of their own. They made their living farming rice, and business was so good that the family were eventually able to construct a second house, right next to their original one. This was a huge point of pride for Tran Van Rang, who saw no greater purpose in life than to care for those who needed him. To the Trans, the future seemed bright. Yet no one could have foreseen the darkness that was about to befall them. According to Tran Quoc Viet, one of the family's eldest sons, the horror began when his younger brother commenced construction of the new family home. Just days after the work started, the family's cattle suddenly became ill. Not long after that, the remaining livestock seemed to collectively lose their minds. Pigs, ducks, chickens, they all went absolutely berserk. They fought amongst themselves and ran into solid concrete walls as if they were terrified by some unseen presence among them. Some noted that the animals appeared to be foaming at the mouth as if afflicted by rabies. Yet there was simply no way that the rabies virus could spread that quickly between animals that had been sequestered into separate paddocks. One by one, the creatures fell, and within just a matter of hours, all except for one of his younger brother's animals had collapsed and died. This one creature, a duck, seemed to be the only living thing immune to this mysterious plague. Within a few days, the same horrifying fate befell their parents' cattle too. It was nothing short of a complete catastrophe, as almost all of the family's wealth was tied up in their livestock. Yet these animal deaths were only the beginning. The family's eldest son, Tran Van Viet, was probably the most successful of the Tran siblings. He already owned a house of his own, had a 5-year-old son, and was described by all as a healthy young man in the prime of his life. But soon, Tran Van Viet began to suffer from mysterious pains, and after they failed to subside, he was admitted to hospital. Frustrated doctors performed test after test, but they simply couldn't determine what was wrong with him. After a while, Tran Van Viet found he was too weak to work, and soon began to display horrifyingly similar symptoms to those suffered by the livestock. Van began foaming at the mouth and suffering intense seizures, but still his doctors failed to offer a logical explanation. Tragically, Tran Van Viet would pass away in mid-2002, leaving his wife a widow and his child fatherless. His death hit the family hard, and when the same bizarre symptoms were spotted in Van's surviving relatives, the psychological effects were almost as devastating as the physical. Tran Van Rang was haunted by his son's death and began drinking heavily. Yet the more he drank, the more his health deteriorated. And barely a month after Van Viet's death, Van Rang would also fall victim to the same violent seizures that took his son. Now 2 of the Tran family had fallen victim to the same mysterious disease. 3 months after Van Rang's death, and in line with Vietnamese customs, 4 generations of the Tran family travelled out to the cemetery in which their former patriarch was buried, with the intention of performing a memorial ceremony. Among the congregation was Tran Van Ut, as well as Tran Van Ut's young son, who joined in mourning his deceased grandfather. Suddenly, the young boy collapsed, and right in front of his grandfather's grave, the child began to suffer the same heavy convulsions that killed Van Rang. He turned purple before frothing at the mouth, and within just a few minutes of the episode commencing, he was dead. In the days that followed, 3 additional members of the Tran family would be rushed to hospital. The Tran mother, Nguyen Tai Dao, passed away during this period, suffering the same horrific symptoms as her departed son and husband. Tran Van Ut soon joined his son in death, his grief rendering him physically incapable of fighting off whatever terrifying illness had gripped his entire family. Tran Van Ut's wife was completely and utterly heartbroken and moved away from Tai Bin in an attempt to escape her boundless grief. Yet, when she did, she noticed something curious. Her symptoms suddenly disappeared. By that point, word of the Tran family's 5 unexplained deaths had frightened and captivated the Vietnamese nation. Hundreds of medical professionals, police officers, and scientists descended on the family's farm, all hoping to prevent any more unnecessary deaths. For 4 straight weeks, the Vietnamese investigation team would pore over the site of the farm in hopes of solving the deadly mystery. They took water samples, air samples, samples of the food the family had been eating. The team even captured a variety of local wildlife species, vivisecting them in hopes of uncovering the phantom disease. Not even the Tran family themselves were above suspicion, and on more than one occasion, Quoc Viet, the last surviving Tran son, noticed he was being followed by police officers in plain clothes. The plot thickened even further when Pham Thi Tham, Phan Rang's mother and the eldest member of the family, died after being rushed to hospital with the same symptoms as her relatives. During the course of her treatment, the nurses tending to her began suffering the same symptoms of the phantom disease. They complained of aches and pains in almost random places, and one nurse even passed out while on duty. In the end, the authorities' official explanation for the Tran family deaths was pesticide poisoning. Yet it should be noted that there was no trace of any deadly pesticides present in the bodies of the victims, nor on any of the land they owned. What's more, despite the official report blaming a pesticide for the deaths, it fails to name the exact substance which killed off the Tran family. So, with the official explanation for the family's sudden, mysterious, and no doubt painful deaths being viewed as absolute codswallop, many Vietnamese believe that their government is covering something up. This has led to a number of conspiracy theories. The more outlandish revolve around evil snake spirits and other dark presences that supposedly call Tai Bin home. The more grounded center around the idea that the Tran family were little more than guinea pigs in a top-secret chemical weapons test. Many have noted that the family's symptoms seem remarkably similar to some Cold War-era nerve agents. And while this theory may well hold some credence, I think I may have a more feasible alternative. If you remember, the deaths of the family's livestock occurred almost immediately after the construction of their new home commenced. Vietnam is a relatively poor country, and although downtown Saigon might indulge in the same vapid glamour as LA or Paris or London, in the countryside, things are built to last. In all likelihood, the Trans would have wanted their new home to last for generations, maybe even centuries. Therefore, it's safe to assume they wanted to lay solid, concrete foundations. Then, in the course of digging up the earth, maybe even laying a few water pipes, it's entirely possible that the Trans inadvertently struck a mercury deposit, which somehow ended up contaminating their water supply. Just listen to this list of mercury poisoning symptoms: abdominal pain, constipation, headaches, irritability, and tingling in the hands and feet. These line up almost to the letter with the Tran family's symptoms. In severe cases, mercury poisoning can cause memory loss, anemia, seizures, coma, and even death. Again, the anemia lines up with Tran Van Viet being too weak to farm, and Tran Van Ut's son, who suffered a seizure so hard it snuffed out his young life. Another article on mercury poisoning states that, quote-unquote, it causes almost 10% of intellectual disability of otherwise unknown cause and can result in behavioral problems. This accounts for why the Tran family was so mystified by their phantom affliction. It was messing with their brains so much that they didn't know what to look for, or even how to look for it. Then there are the 2 nurses who had aches and bouts of fainting just from being in the presence of the elderly Pham Thi Tham. In high enough concentrations, mercury can indeed contaminate the surrounding air enough to poison someone. As for the Vietnamese government, Why would they lie about pesticides being present at the scene? Well, in the most respectful way possible, the Vietnamese government haven't always been the most honest or transparent. It certainly wouldn't be the first time a government minister had covered up a cock-up to save their own skin. What if, many years earlier, some government official had been in charge of a gold mine or was responsible for the burning of coal? Both are activities that release mercury into the environment, but no doubt that same official would be responsible for the cleanup too. But what if it was quicker and easier to quite literally bury the evidence of negligence so the team could finish whatever project they had early? That would mean a promotion for the team leader, maybe even a bonus for the rank and file gold miners. So instead, they covered it up. Granted, it's pure speculation on my part, but little else could explain why the government would lie about such a thing. Well, in January of 2020, the Vietnam Academy of Science and Technology released a paper which concluded that, quote-unquote, the concentration of mercury in the coastal sediment of Tai Binh is 5 times that of other areas. Such pollution is possibly a result of some misuses of mercurial fungicides in that region. Therefore, it's necessary to carry out further studies to fully evaluate the risks of this contamination, for example, about its effects on the food chain. I hope the scientists who produced this paper continue to study Tai Binh's mercury pollution, and I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised to find out that their quest for answers leads them right back to a little farm in the countryside, one where 6 members of the same family tragically lost their lives to the same terrible, mysterious affliction. In all likelihood, someone somewhere up in the chain of command in the Vietnamese government has the blood of the Tran family firmly on their hands. Perhaps the only real mystery is if they'll ever face justice for it. Brian Schaefer was a guy who seemingly had it all. A great family, an active social life, a girlfriend who thought the world of him, and a very promising future in medicine. Then, one day, in 2006, that promising future disappeared, along with Brian himself. During a night out with a close friend, the young academic vanished from the face of the earth in a manner that's left everyone scratching their heads for the past 15 years. The investigation into his disappearance led detectives down a deep rabbit hole of unanswered questions. Trust me when I say that this is a strange one. So join me as we try to answer this one question. What happened to Brian Schaefer? Back in 2006, Brian was a 27-year-old med student in his second year of study at Ohio State University. It was there that he met his girlfriend, fellow second-year med student, Alexis Wagner. The pair fell deeply in love, and Alexis was under the impression that Brian was planning to propose to her that very year, most likely in April during a vacation they had planned to Miami. Sadly, it was also during that year that tragedy struck the Schaefer family. In March, Brian's mother Renee passed away from myodysplasia. Brian and his mum were extremely close, and the loss of her hit him like a ton of bricks. Still, on the outside, he appeared to be handling things well, according to his friends at least, and he continued to speak excitedly about his upcoming trip to Miami. There was nothing Brian enjoyed more than getting away somewhere tropical. Everyone who knew him would tell you that Brian enjoyed that laid-back lifestyle that such places embodied, and that even though he was pursuing a career in medicine of all things, his real passion was music. He often spoke about his dream of becoming a musician and living the easy life. He'd once written on his MySpace page, "This whole doctor thing is really just a job, only temporary, until I get my band together and put a record out." March 31st, 2006 was a Friday. It was also the start of spring break. Now, March had been a particularly hard month for young Brian. Not only had the poor guy lost his mother, but he'd been pulling all-nighters cramming for exams. Even though his trip to Florida with Alexis was only 3 days away, the dawn of spring break seemed like a cause for early celebration. That evening, Brian met up with his father, Randy, for a steak dinner. Despite being obviously exhausted, Brian told his old man that he had plans to meet up with a friend later that night. That friend was Clint Florence. He and Brian were former roommates, and the pair were reportedly close. Randy suggested that Brian take things easy, maybe catch an early night. Brian objected. After the month that he'd just had, he needed a boys' night out. At 9 PM, Brian and Clint met up at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a quintessential college bar in the Arena district of Columbus. And yes, that is how us Brits pronounce tuna. No comments down below, please. Brian's girlfriend Alexis was in Toledo, visiting her parents before their big trip to Miami. He called her at around 10 to wish her good night. They exchanged I love yous and hung up. According to her, he sounded completely normal on the phone. Little could Alexis have realized that that was the last time she would ever speak to her boyfriend. Brian and Clint went bar hopping all around town that night, visiting 7 bars in total. Clint would later tell detectives that they'd taken a shot at every location before arriving in Columbus's short north. It was there that the duo became a trio as they met up with Clint's friend, Meredith Reed. The 3 musketeers made their way back to the Ugly Tuna Saloona for one last round. They arrived around 1:15 AM. 45 minutes later, when the bar was closing, Clint and Meredith realized that Brian had gone off somewhere. They both tried calling him several times, but he didn't pick up. They waited outside the bar for him, and when he didn't come out with the rest of the crowd, they assumed he had already gone home to his apartment just a couple of blocks away. But he hadn't. Brian's girlfriend and father tried calling him constantly during that weekend, but he never answered the phone. When he missed his flight to Miami on Monday, April 3rd, they reported him missing. Randy was really starting to worry at this point. The guy had just lost his wife. Had he now lost his son too? Sergeant John Hurst, a father himself, understood Randy's worries, and he and his team of investigators got to work right away. Now, usually in these types of cases, there's at least a clear reason why the person disappeared, or where they might have disappeared to. That wasn't the case with Brian. The detectives weren't even sure whether he'd gone missing on his own accord, or if someone else was responsible. So they started from the most logical place, the beginning, and checked the CCTV cameras both inside and outside the Gateway Film Center, the building the Ugly Tuna Saloona was located in. Since that area wasn't the nicest part of town, there were surveillance cameras aplenty. Surprisingly, however, the footage generated more questions than answers. As expected, at 1:15 AM, Brian was caught on CCTV riding the escalator to the second floor with Clint and Meredith and entering the bar. Shortly after, both Brian and Clint were again recorded standing just outside the bar, flirting with 2 women, Brighton Zatko and Amber Ruick. Brian even reportedly kissed Brighton on the neck. At 1:57 AM, the cameras again showed him standing just outside the bar, again with Brighton, who put her number into Brian's phone. She headed back into the bar to use the bathroom. When she returned, Brian was gone. The footage appeared to show him turn and re-enter the bar shortly after Brighton went to use the bathroom. Those are his last known movements. You see, the cameras never showed Brian leaving the bar. A few minutes later at 2 AM when the bar closed, the cameras captured the flood of people leaving the tuna, heading down the escalators and out of the building. Investigators identified everyone who left the bar that night, and Brian was definitely not amongst them. Footage from all of the outside street cameras were also checked, but there was still no trace of the guy. Brighton and Amber were tracked down and cleared of any involvement. Dozens of officers searched night and day for Brian. All of the local hospitals and shelters were checked. The sewers were scoured. Sniffer dogs were brought in to track his scent. Posters were put up everywhere, and a hefty award was announced. Possible sightings of him in Texas, Michigan, even as far as Sweden were investigated and discounted. Doors were knocked on, questions were asked, but no one seemed to know anything. After he disappeared, Brian's apartment was burgled. This brought fresh hope to the case. Surely this burglary was connected to Brian's vanishing. It wasn't, and turned out just to be a coincidence. Brian's favourite music group was Pearl Jam, and frontman Eddie Vedder took some time off during a concert to mention the case and appeal for any leads. Nobody came forward with information. Desperate for answers, Brian's father Randy paid a psychic to help find his son, and was told that his body was somewhere in the Olentangy River. Randy thoroughly searched that river, and almost lost his own life in a whirlpool, but ultimately found no trace of his boy. Brian's girlfriend Alexis called his mobile every night, but her calls never went through. Except for one night, that is, several months after he had disappeared, when it actually rang a few times before disconnecting. Brian's phone company later said that it could have been a cellular glitch. His phone also pinged in Hilliard, just 14 miles from where he went missing. Another glitch, or evidence of something more sinister? Since Brian disappeared in 2006, his phone has never been used to make a call, and his credit card hasn't been used to make a single purchase. As bad a sign as that is, to this day, his whereabouts and well-being remain unknown. We'll start with the obvious theory. Brian met with foul play. Either he said the wrong thing to the wrong guy at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, or looked at the wrong guy's girlfriend the wrong way, or went down the wrong street at the wrong time on his way home. Sure, things like that happen all the time. But none of the other customers that night noticed Brian getting into an argument with anyone, and the guy didn't exactly have any enemies to speak of, so if there was somebody waiting to jump him, it was most likely a stranger. Some people believe that Brian's friend Clint was somehow responsible for his disappearance, or at least know some details about it, because even though he told his side of the story to the authorities, to this day, he still refuses to take a lie detector test. Personally, I don't think that's suspicious. Contrary to popular belief, lie detector tests are seriously unreliable, and are just as likely to get an innocent man into trouble as they are to take him out of it. Clint's lawyer likely advised him not to take the test. A sound decision, and certainly not indicative of him being guilty of Brian's possible death. That doesn't mean that someone didn't kill him, of course, but the main problem with this theory are those CCTV cameras. The areas outside both the bar and the Gateway Film Center building in general were covered, and they didn't capture Brian leaving the premises. Where would the perp have jumped him? Where would they have hidden his body? So if there's no videotape of him leaving the bar, then Brian's still inside the Ugly Tuna Saloon, right? As crazy as it sounds, some people believe that Brian somehow died in the bar that night after all the other customers had left, likely in the bathroom. Terrified of a lawsuit, the bar owner and his staff switched off the security cameras both inside and outside the establishment, tampered with the footage which had already been recorded, and hid Brian's body either under the floorboards or within the walls. That would explain why he was never captured on tape leaving the bar, but it completely falls apart when you hear that investigators searched the Ugly Tuna Saloon from top to bottom and didn't find any trace of Brian inside whatsoever. What about if they switched off the cameras outside the building as well, snuck him out, and disposed of his remains elsewhere? Well, that theory's still pretty hard to believe. Not only would the owner have had to convince his underpaid staff to go along with his plan, they'd also have to somehow get their hands on the CCTV footage of all of the surrounding businesses. Though technically not impossible, that seems extremely improbable. Still, since there's still no explanation for how young Mr. Schaefer left the building that night, wild theories like this are bound to crop up. Speaking of wild, one of the darkest and most controversial theories is that Brian fell victim to the Smiley Face Killers, aka the SFK. Between the late 1990s and early 2010s, a surprisingly large number of young, well-educated, college-aged men were found dead in bodies of water across several Midwestern states. We're talking hundreds of men. At least 45 of these were determined to be the work of either one or multiple killers, and more than 200 others are still being looked into. Almost all of these slain men were athletic, popular, and successful college students, and almost all of them were targeted on their way home after spending a night on the town. It's been theorized that all of these slayings were the work of one well-organized, nationwide group called the Smiley Face Killers, who targeted, quote-unquote, privileged men. In at least a dozen of these cases, a smiley face was found graffitied at the spots where the bodies had been dumped. It's said that the SFK communicate through the dark web to select their targets. Brian was 6'2", athletically built, highly intelligent, and from a privileged background. Exactly the type of guy that the SFK targeted. With that in mind, it's easy to see why many internet sleuths link the SFK to Brian's disappearance. Still, it's never been conclusively proven that the SFK are a real group. Smiley faces are a very common thing for people to graffiti. Just walk through your city and count how many times you bump into one. It's possible that their presence at all these spots was just a coincidence. With no further evidence to prove that the purported SFK were somehow involved in Brian's disappearance, or that they even exist, this theory lacks weight. Regardless, it's a possibility I had to share. so we know that Brian wasn't caught on camera leaving the bar. We're also sure that he isn't still inside there somewhere, and that the staff didn't tamper with the video footage. That must mean that he vanished in the small space between the building's exit and the outside area that the cameras covered, the so-called dead zone outside the camera's view. Well, as you can see, that dead zone was only a step or two. There was nowhere for him to disappear to. Nowhere, that is, but down. Just outside the ugly tuna saloona was a service exit that led to a construction site. On that site, workers had dug a big hole. It would have been extremely difficult for Brian to leave via that exit without being detected, but crucially, not impossible. If he stayed close to the wall, he could have snuck past the camera's field of view. The whole theory then suggests that Brian, for whatever reason, stumbled out that exit, wandered into the construction site, and fell into the hole. He either died or was knocked out from the fall, or, unable to escape and at the end of a heavy night, simply fell asleep. The next morning, the construction workers failed to spot Brian inside the hole and covered him in cement. Perhaps Brian's been much closer to home all this time than anyone could have imagined. Sadly, this theory too has its flaws, since according to the construction workers at the site, if Brian had fell into the hole, it would have been impossible for them to have missed him. So, unless the building team just so happened to all be opportunistic killers, we're right back where we started. Then again, people, even multiple people, can sometimes make mistakes. To me, this seems like the most plausible theory so far. Finally, with no body and no suspects to speak of, is it possible that Brian didn't meet with a grisly fate at all, and that he actually went missing on his own accord? In my opinion, the running away and starting a new life elsewhere explanation rarely turns out to be realistic. I mean, people have been searching for Brian for the past 15 years, and despite having a lot of defining features and his case becoming quite prolific, the guy still hasn't been found. On top of that, setting up a new identity and starting your life from scratch is no easy thing to do, especially for a guy in Brian's position. He wasn't exactly a man with nothing to lose. It doesn't make much sense that Brian would randomly decide to throw away his relationships and career prospects. But what if it wasn't a random decision? Like I said at the beginning of this video, as intelligent and academically gifted as Brian was, he always longed for a simple life. A relaxed life. The life of a musician. Maybe he'd gotten burned out from his years of study. Maybe the prospect of becoming a doctor, or the long hours, intense workload and stress, had him dreaming of a way out. With his girlfriend expecting a ring and all the responsibilities that come with it, the realities of his upcoming future may not have aligned with his expectations. I think we all know that feeling to some degree, that our lives are planned out for us way too early, and oftentimes that plan isn't plan A. Sometimes that plan is somebody else's altogether, and in our heart of hearts, we want nothing to do with it. Could it be possible that Brian was secretly having those kind of thoughts? Could it be possible that he was planning on escaping the life he was leading without telling a soul? It may have just been a fantasy that he was playing within his mind until the loss of his mother, which could have pushed him over the edge. Indeed, Renee's death likely affected Brian's mental state a lot more than people realized, and it's easy to see how that could have been the emotional catalyst that finally made him decide to shed his identity altogether and change the path he was walking down in life. His once crazy fantasy may have not seemed so crazy anymore. As compelling as that all sounds, this theory still fails to answer that one nagging question. How did Brian manage to get out of the building without being caught on CCTV? Some people have pointed out that he could have somehow disguised himself and kept his head down, but neither his friend Clint nor anyone that he met that night said that he was carrying a spare change of clothes. That's definitely the sort of thing you'd notice and comment on. One of the detectives on the case also told the Columbus Monthly that they were 100% certain Brian hadn't left through the main entrance in disguise. Given that Brian had been putting in heaps of effort up until that point, cramming for his exams, his decision to leave and never come back was likely made in the spur of the moment. Without thorough planning, it's hard to see how he could have left undetected. Wouldn't he have just, left via the front door with everyone else and walked off into the night? And I do mean walk, since if he did decide to leave, he didn't take his car with him. It was found still parked outside his apartment. Would he have really left something so useful and expensive behind? Personally, I don't think I buy this one. In fact, I don't really buy any of these theories. That's what makes this case so bizarre. Nothing really seems to add up. So, where does this all leave us? Unfortunately, in a place without any answers. Even if the truth does one day bubble to the surface though, Brian's father Randy will never get the closure he so desperately craved. He died back in 2008 while clearing debris from his yard. A sudden windstorm caused a branch to break off a nearby tree. It was caught by the wind and hit Randy in the head. The next morning, his neighbors found his body. There was an online condolence book where his friends and loved ones left him goodbye messages. One of these messages read, "To Dad, love, Brian, US Virgin Islands." Finally, there was a development, and Brian's brother and last surviving family member, Derek, had renewed hope that his long-lost big bro was still alive. Sadly, this message turned out to be a callous hoax, posted by some anonymous degenerate from a computer in a public library. Shortly after, an anonymous tip was made, claiming that Brian's remains could be found in a field just outside of Columbus. Sniffer dogs combed all of the fields on the city's outskirts. They found nothing. Just another cruel joke. Many that were close to Brian are sure that he's dead, his body hidden away somewhere in the city. They say that, if he truly were alive, he would have returned home after the loss of his father. There's no way he would have allowed his younger brother Derek to go through life without a family member by his side. Derek himself still remains hopeful that his brother is alive somewhere though, and believes that Brian's friend Clint may know more than he's letting on. In Derek's words, "I've always thought Clint definitely knows something, just won't come forward with it. If Brian did take off somewhere, if that is the case, we just always had a strong feeling that Clint would possibly know that." Brian's former girlfriend Alexis also believes that Clint might be holding back information, though she herself remains certain that Brian is no longer alive, saying that he would never abandon her and his family. As previously mentioned, a lot of suspicion has fallen on Clint due to him refusing to take a lie detector test. Though I don't blame him for that, it's entirely possible that he is holding back some information. The pair were close, and it's possible that Brian confided in him, told him about his plan to vanish that very night, and made him swear to never tell a soul. Still, that's just speculation. Then again, speculating's all we can really do at this point. It's honestly quite remarkable how little evidence there is to work with in this case. How one man can so thoroughly disappear from the face of the earth is anyone's guess. The biggest question of them all is how he exited the bar without being caught on camera. Without that first piece of the puzzle to work with, it's basically impossible to fill in the rest of the picture. But what do you think? Is one of the theories I covered correct? Does Clint really know more than he's letting on? Is Brian alive or not? In either case, where is he now? Let me know your thoughts down below, and if there are ever any new developments, I'll be sure to update you. Until then, the only thing we can be sure of is that someone knows something, even if that someone is actually just Brian himself. In October of 1965, Jonathan Paul Luna was born in New York City to low-income parents. He spent the majority of his childhood in the South Bronx's Patterson Housing Project, a high-rise, post-war public housing development situated near the iconic Yankee Stadium. Following its completion in the early 1950s, the tenants who flooded into the development were an eclectic mix of African Americans, Hispanics, and Southeast Asians. They shared their food, their music, and their culture. And, like with all peaceful, diverse communities, interracial marriages became increasingly common as time went by, and this is exactly how Jonathan's parents came together, his father being Filipino and his mother being African American. They were poor, but they adored their son, and they supported him both materially and emotionally, and their support paid off. By the time Jonathan was in middle school, his intelligence and industriousness made it clear that he was destined for great things. After high school, Jonathan would attend Fordham University in his native New York City, before moving down to North Carolina to study law at Chapel Hill. Upon graduating with distinction, he gained a position at the prestigious Washington, D.C. law firm, Arnold & Porter, eventually using his experience to earn himself a job in Baltimore as an assistant United States attorney in 1999. It was a true rags-to-riches story. A young man from the South Bronx was now one of the United States' elite civil servants, and his paycheck most certainly reflected that. Jonathan was now able to provide his loving, supportive parents with the kinds of luxuries that would have been alien to them during their youth. It was a wholesome, heartwarming start to a brand new chapter in his life. But sadly, it was one that would also end in horrible and mysterious circumstances. By 2003, Jonathan and his obstetrician wife, Angela, had started a small family, and his career was going from strength to strength. It was also around this time that Jonathan became involved in a case involving Walter Poindexter and Dion Smith, two men accused of using their recording studio as a front to deal heroin. But it seems he had more on his plate than just a high-profile narcotics case. The previous year, Jonathan had overseen the prosecution of those responsible for a rather lucrative bank robbery. Some of the evidence in the case included huge boxes of unmarked dollar bills, some containing tens of thousands of dollars. Yet, at the end of the case, when all of the money was being accounted for, it was discovered that around $36,000 of it had gone missing. Despite his history of integrity and loyalty, Jonathan was horrified to discover that he was considered one of the main suspects. Following the discovery that Jonathan was in $25,000 worth of credit card debt and had suddenly come into around $10,000 that he couldn't account for, the case against him became very damning indeed. So while December of 2003 saw Jonathan focusing on the Poindexter-Smith narcotics case, we have to be aware that these corruption allegations were very much in the foreground for him. On the night of Wednesday, December 3rd, Jonathan was working late on some plea deals at the Baltimore courthouse. He had already been home that evening to grab some dinner with his wife, but had returned to the office to finish up the plea deals for the Poindexter-Smith case. At some point after 11 PM, Jonathan received a telephone call. It's not clear who this call was from, but it was urgent enough for Jonathan to leave the office without his glasses. Technically, Jonathan needed these glasses for driving, but whatever the phone call concerned, it was obviously important enough that he didn't feel the need to return for them, even though he was about to make a 200-mile round trip. After tracking his electronic footprint, we know that Jonathan used an I-95 toll booth in Delaware, then withdrew $200 from an ATM at the JFK Plaza Service Center near Newark. He then used the Delaware River toll bridge to access the Pennsylvania Turnpike, then used his debit card to buy gasoline at the Sunoco King of Prussia Service Plaza at around 3:20 AM. Just after 4 in the morning, his car exited the turnpike at the Reading-Lancaster interchange, but instead of using his Easy Pass, Jonathan paid cash for a paper ticket. Then, when this ticket was handed back to the corresponding attendant, they noticed it had flecks of blood on it. Blood that was later confirmed to be Jonathan's. It's not known how he came to be injured in a way that caused him to carelessly leave blood on a toll ticket, but it certainly sets a grim tone for what would happen when Jonathan parked his car at the rear of the Sensenig and Weaver Well Drilling Company headquarters in Denver, Pennsylvania. Later that morning, at approximately 5 AM, the first of Sensenig and Weaver's employees arrived to begin their shift. After grabbing some coffee and tucking into their breakfast, this employee saw a red light shining out from some trees at the rear of the building. Thinking it may have been a drunk driver that had careened off the road, the employee went to check it out. After walking through the trees for a minute or so, this employee came across a car that had been driven into a nearby stream. Lying in front of it, face down in the water, was the lifeless body of an adult male, still wearing a suit jacket, trousers, and dress shoes. The Sensenig and Weaver employee rushed to call 911, and when police officers arrived on the scene, they discovered that the dead man was still wearing an ID card around his neck. The name on it? Jonathan Luna. A forensic examiner discovered a large pool of blood in the back seat of Jonathan's car, with some of it smeared on the driver's side door, as well as the bonnet. His autopsy revealed a head injury, bruising to his chest and neck, and shockingly, more than 30 different stab wounds inflicted by a 3-inch pocket knife. The official cause of death was determined to be drowning, owing to the fact that Jonathan was found face down in the stream and had water in his lungs. Pennsylvania's Lancaster County Sheriff's Office, as well as 2 separate coroners, all declared that Jonathan's death was an obvious homicide. Not only had they found a second blood type at the scene, but also a partial print from someone else other than the victim. Coupled with the grainy footage from one of the gas stations Jonathan had stopped at, which appeared to show him in the company of another man, the conclusion seemed obvious. Jonathan was murdered. However, for some inexplicable reason, the FBI essentially took over the investigation before swiftly declaring that Jonathan had actually taken his own life. The FBI agents explained that one of their reasons for coming to such a conclusion was Jonathan's lack of defensive wounds. Defensive wounds occur when a person tries to defend themselves from a potentially fatal attack, and often come in the form of stab wounds, slashes, and bullet holes to the hands, fingers, and forearms. But if Jonathan was sat close enough to his murderer, in the back seat for example, and he suddenly began stabbing him up close, this might adequately explain the lack of such injuries. The FBI also suggested that the shallow stab wounds to his torso were what they called hesitation marks. Forensic scientists define hesitation marks as any of a series of shallow cuts made by a person considering ending their own life. Yet surely these kinds of wounds are just as easily explained by the chaotic nature of a violent struggle. The FBI even put forth a reason for Jonathan taking his own life, saying it confirmed his guilt in the theft of the $36,000 from the Baltimore bank robbery case. Various other theories floated around for a while, some involving online dating sites, fake kidnappings, and an FBI cover-up. But whatever happened to Jonathan, it seems very, very unlikely that he took his own life. Of all of the methods with which a person might do so, death by 36 penknife cuts, followed by a shallow water drowning, is far from the quickest or most painless. And if Jonathan had planned to kill himself, why take out $200 if he didn't intend to spend it? And why drive 100 miles to a creek in the middle of nowhere? In a case like Jonathan's, the only thing we can truly be certain of is uncertainty. There are too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. So for arguably the most famous law enforcement agency in the world to come out and definitively declare that Jonathan had taken his own life, that's very suspicious indeed. Interest in Jonathan's case has been widespread for quite some time, and in February of 2020, the Pennsylvania-based LMP newspaper requested that a judge unseal coroner's records pertaining to Luna's death. It took almost a year for Judge David Ashworth to announce that the documents would remain sealed, adding that releasing them would constitute, quote-unquote, a threat of substantially hindering or jeopardizing the open, active, and ongoing criminal investigation into the death of Jonathan Luna. So, it seems this latest development in the Luna case raises a new and much more sinister question. Just to what exactly does the FBI have to hide? Kosuke Nozaki, better known by his self-penned nickname, the Don Juan of Kishu, was one of Japan's richest and most famous men. He made his fortune in real estate, but grabbed headlines for his very active love life. If his nickname didn't give it away, Japan's very own Don Juan spent his fortune wooing a lot of ladies. And when I say a lot, I mean he had apparently charmed the pants off 4,000 women. Well, perhaps he didn't charm them off. I'm sure the $28 million in his bank account went a long way in helping. Throughout the land of the rising sun, the guy became infamous, and even penned a best-selling autobiography in which he wrote about how he had no interest in money, and only worked hard to make it as a means to seduce as many beautiful young women as he could. He had reportedly spent millions on his romantic pursuits, and was quoted as saying, "I know all this nighttime activity may cause my death, but if I can die in the sack and go to heaven, then I'm good." Well, you can't say the guy didn't know what he wanted out of life. One young lady was able to tame the aging tycoon, however. In 2018, 77-year-old Don Juan married 22-year-old fashion model Saki Sudo. She described herself as a fashion model, at least. In actuality, she was a former adult movie star. Now, why might a young woman like her marry an old man like him? It probably had something to do with the fact that Don Juan promised her an allowance of $1 million yen a month. That's around $9,000. Not too shabby. Their marriage hit a slight road bump, however, when only 3 months in, old Don Juan suddenly died under mysterious circumstances. On May 24th, 2018, the couple were eating dinner together at Don Juan's home in Wakayama when he curiously dropped dead. An autopsy revealed a huge quantity of stimulants in his system, enough to kill a regular man several times over. The old mogul wasn't known to take any kind of substances, and the sheer amount of stimulants he'd ingested meant this definitely wasn't an accident. The prospect of Don Juan taking his own life was also ruled out. That left one possibility: homicide. News of Don Juan's death spread like wildfire, becoming the main headline in every Japanese newspaper. It was a real media frenzy. Still is. The Don had spent the last 4 hours of his life alone with Saki, his wife, and with no other witnesses or leads, the authorities quickly determined that she must have poisoned her husband. This was likely so she could get her hands on a portion of his estate and business. His house in Wakayama alone was worth an estimated 1.3 billion yen. Just 2 months after her husband's death, Saki just so happened to make herself president of his business empire and decided she deserved a salary of $1.5 million a year. She also transferred $300,000 from the business into her personal account on the same day she announced all this to her shareholders. Suspicious. Eyebrows were also raised when she was seen laughing and playing games on her mobile phone during her husband's funeral. But why risk killing her 77-year-old husband? Why not just live off her generous allowance and wait for time to take care of him instead? Well, as it turns out, Saki wasn't the kind of wife Don Juan was hoping for, and it came to light that he had served her with divorce papers shortly before the night of his death. Divorce in Japan works a little differently to the USA and UK, and if the pair were to split, Saki would be left with a pittance of what she could take by force. Still, she didn't admit to taking her husband's life, and with no clear evidence that she was responsible, Saki remained a free woman. For a time, at least. For 3 years, the case saw hardly any new developments. In January 2021, however, the authorities caught wind that Saki Suda was planning to move to Dubai, permanently. Plans that had been delayed because of the global situation. Detectives were sure that she was the one responsible for Don Juan's death, so despite not having a particularly strong case, they decided to act before she left Japan for good. On April 28th, Saki was arrested and held without charge for questioning. Believe it or not, in Japan, the police can actually hold you for up to 23 days without charging you. They used all 23 of those days, during which time Saki refused to answer any questions and continued to profess her innocence. Regardless, the authorities went ahead and charged her with the slaying of Don Juan. Seeing how this all happened very recently, Saki Suda's trial is still in its early stages. Due to the rushed nature of the proceedings, the prosecutors still don't have much evidence to work with, but that doesn't mean they have nothing. During their investigation, detectives found that Saki had been researching stimulants online not long before her husband's death. Traces of the stimulant that killed Don Juan were also found on the floor and inside a vacuum cleaner in the house, suggesting that Saki had tried to cover her tracks before calling for help. What's more, her phone records show that she had been in contact with a shady substance salesman, a man who the prosecutors alleged sold Saki the stimulant. Forensic tracing proved that she and the dealer were in the same place at the same time, shortly before Don Juan's murder took place. The final piece of damning evidence they have, and if you're an animal lover, you might want to cover your ears here, is that mere days before Don Juan's poisoning, Saki Suda's dog also mysteriously passed away. It's believed that she tested the poison on her dog first, just to check that it would work before trying to kill her husband with it. She didn't want Don Juan surviving and pointing the finger at her now, did she? Well, as you can see, she actually did a pretty good job of doing that all by herself. Now admittedly, most of this evidence is circumstantial, but it just might be enough to see her go down for Don Juan's death. She had the means, she had the motive, and from her phone and internet records, it appears she had the will. The Japan Times are actually keeping up with this case in English, so be sure to keep an eye out and see what happens. The best things happen in the dark.